All righty. Well, I see that several other folks are joining the meeting today. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name's Tom Byerly. I'm with Ross Strategic. We're helping to support the work of the climate investment funds for the Global Energy Storage Program. And I appreciate everyone joining in for today's event, keeping the power on, the business case for emerging energy storage technologies. This is a meeting that's hosted by climate investment funds and in partnership with the U.S. Department of Energy and partners of the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. Our meeting today is the second in a series of Global Energy Storage Program events this year. I think probably many people joining in today also joined us for a meeting in May. And the focus of this meeting is really on energy storage technologies, the range of technologies that are available, but also the business case for those energy storage technologies. So given the options available, how do we think about energy storage fit for purpose in particular contexts in countries, in regions, or in particular facilities? So that's what we'll be focusing in on today. We'll be talking a little bit later about additional global energy storage program learning platforms events later in the year. But why don't I go ahead and turn it over to Daniel Morris with Climate Investment Funds to introduce folks and talk a little bit more about the Global Energy Storage Program. Danny?
Thanks, Tom. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, everyone. Glad you could be here with us. My name is Danny Morris. I'm the Clean Energy Lead for the Climate Investment Funds and the Program Coordinator for the Global Energy Storage Program. Let's move to the next slide, please. I think most of you know who we are, but for those who don't, the Climate Investment Funds are an $8 billion family of funds focused on driving climate action in 325 programs in 72 developing countries. We have a very simple and effective business model. We work in partnership with 6 multilateral development bank partners to provide large amounts of concessional finance. That finance is risk-bearing, it's patient, it's offered at below market rates to support projects across the entire suite of climate actions. That includes clean energy, energy access, sustainable transport, climate resilience, and forestry. Our Global Energy Storage Program is one of the newest efforts that we have undertaken. The program itself has about $340 million in resources available, which builds on a portfolio of $400 million in existing storage investments that the climate investment funds have already undertaken. Can we move to the next slide, please? The Global Energy Storage Program business model takes the CIS business model to drive investment in a range of storage technologies, which include batteries, but also things like pumped hydro storage, thermal storage, green hydrogen. It also includes resources for policy interventions, technical assistance, and knowledge coordination. So the effort is really one that tries to capture the entirety of energy storage development in developing countries. I just want to give you all a quick update on the status of the program since we last met. We have, since the beginning of the year, approved 5 projects worth $70 million. Those projects are mostly battery projects focused in South Africa, Ukraine, Honduras, Haiti, and a small regional program in the Latin American Caribbean region. Looking at the pipeline that we have, which is pretty substantial, still over around 900 million compared to the resource envelope of 340. We expect a lot of good projects to come through, and we've gone through and calculated what we think will be the results of that. So I've listed some of them here. These are projections based on our previous experience with our portfolio in the climate investment funds, particularly under the Clean Technology Fund, which is our largest fund. We're looking at a potential for 100 million metric tons of lifetime emissions reductions from the program. We're also looking at 1.8 gigawatts of potential installed storage capacity. which will translate to 1.6 billion in USD in economic value. And we're also expecting, even though it's cut off on the slide here, 3 billion in co-financing from our MDB partners, national governments, private sector, and other contributors. So we have big expectations for the program. And the good news is we'll be able to track this as we go along. Those of you who joined us last time will remember the presentation that we gave on our monitoring and reporting toolkit, which is now up and running. We'll be using that toolkit to track progress over time against these expected results and see how we're doing. Next slide, please. So to complement the growing portfolio missions, we've coordinated this learning platform, which is intended to support a dialogue and knowledge exchange between us and many other stakeholders with different perspectives, including technical experts, private sector folks, local and national government officials, utilities, the broad range, as wide as we can reach, of people interested in storage technology. Our first event, which happened on May 12th and 13th, many of you were there, was a great start to building those connections. We were able to attract 400 participants from nearly 70 countries. We got two key outcomes from that event that help us with this event. The first is that we heard from many of you about what are some of the critical issues that you have, or critical questions that you have on storage technologies. These questions, which I placed on the slide here, helped us design the agenda for today. So some of the most prominent ones with a technological focus were: what technologies are most relevant for developing countries? How can technology be made cheaper in those countries? What are the costs of energy storage? What is their commercial viability? And how can you evaluate the value of storage? So after the event, we put our heads together and we said, well, what's a good way to approach this? What's a useful framing that we can discuss? And what we came up with is essentially talking about the business case. And how does one sort of develop a business case for storage in a developing country context? And how does one look at that? So that's what has built the agenda for the day. We're going to get into that a lot more in depth in just a minute. The second thing that came out of the event was it helped advance and solidify a partnership that we had started initially with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, who's part of the US DOE laboratory network, but has helped bring in folks from all over the Department of Energy to share their knowledge. And we are very excited to have experts from DOE bring that knowledge to you. Our DOE partners were instrumental in designing the agenda, and we're really hopeful that you all will benefit from their expertise and insight. So to kick things off, I would like to turn the floor over to one of those experts. His name is Stefan Hendrickson. He's a program manager for the Office of Technology Transitions at Department of Energy. He's going to start us off with a rich discussion on the technological work that DOE is undertaking through the Energy Storage Grand Challenge. Stefan, over to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone, or good day, depending on where you are. I'm Stephen Hendrickson. I'm a program manager at Office of Technology Transitions at the U.S. Department of Energy, as Danny mentioned. First off, I'd just like to thank Danny, Tom, John Alam from PNNL, others for bringing this group together and for inviting me and the department to participate. I think it is a great agenda and we'll have a lot of great discussion. My goal for the next few minutes is just to give you some background on what we do in OTT and kind of set the stage for what the Energy Storage Grand Challenge is seeking to accomplish. And we'll lead into the further discussions for the rest of the day. Within the Office of Technology Transitions at DOE, I lead our market analysis activities. So I work with a lot of my counterparts in the different program offices and national labs that you're going to hear from throughout the day, working to understand where the market is today, where it's headed, and how that might help us to identify commercialization opportunities for DOE developed technologies. So with that, if next slide, please. Sorry, one more. Thanks. So the Office of Technology Transitions, we're kind of unique. We're a relatively small office within DOE, but we seek to accelerate the commercialization and adoption of technologies that are developed by the department. So US DOE is spending about $18 billion a year on research and development. And that's conducted all across the 17 national labs through other external partners, universities, et cetera. And so we are looking for partnerships with the private sector, other external entities, financing mechanisms, et cetera, to get the technology out of the lab into the marketplace to solve problems, to have a positive impact on people's lives. And that's why I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you, because this is exactly the kind of relationships we're looking to build to have the cutting edge technology have a real world impact and really solve multiple problems at the same time. So with that, you can go to the next slide. So some of you may be familiar with this kind of a framework, but I think what I want to highlight is that while the department spends a lot of time and effort on the research and development steps in technology commercialization, what we're really looking to do is augment what's being done on the demonstration and deployment dimension. So in particular, with demonstration, being able to do either first of a kind or relatively new demonstration of technologies in operation in a real world context to help de-risk that technology so that investors, so that companies, customers, et cetera, get familiar with how that technology operates, how it performs sort of over the short, medium, long term. And that brings the cost of financing that project down. That makes various stakeholders more comfortable with what that technology can do. And so that's what we're really focused on, in particular with energy storage and other technologies, is get the technology out of the lab into the marketplace so people can get used to how it operates within a system context, what kind of value it can provide. And that's really going to accelerate the technology adoption. At the same time, deployment is also looking at sort of broader deployment. So I know, I think with this group and kind of where you're coming from, some technologies that are sort of earlier stage, the demonstration opportunity is there. At the same time, there may be technologies that are proven from a technical point of view that haven't been utilized in a particular sort of market context or in a particular country or region or market structure. And we're also looking for opportunities to identify sort of the barriers to adoption and ways that we can work together to demonstrate and deploy that technology. If you go to the next slide. So with all that in mind, the Energy Storage Grand Challenge really lays out an integrated strategy for the department and with our federal partners and our external partners across the globe for the U.S. to support, to show leadership in the development of new energy storage technologies, the manufacturing and the utilization. And we're really looking for the U.S. to contribute new technologies to support a global energy system that is resilient, flexible, affordable, and secure. I'm sure a lot of those kind of themes ring true for many of you as far as like what you're looking to do in the various regions of the world that you operate, and that's where we're looking for basically translating from kind of a high level strategy to what that can look like down like in a specific project context, a specific market context for what are the problems that different energy storage technologies can solve, and what is it going to take to get that technology built and operating on a system and providing value to customers. So as you see, we have a number of different high-level goals that have been laid out by the administration in terms of decarbonizing electricity, decarbonizing the transportation sector, energy-intensive industries. Energy storage can solve a number of problems that are both a priority for our government as well as in regional contexts around the world, as well as other sort of environmental, economic, and security concerns that people have where energy storage can play a critical role. Next slide. So the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, first I just wanted to highlight, kind of building on Danny's point, that for us, it's really including any technology domain that the department's involved in where that can provide the energy storage services. So that's bidirectional electricity storage, chemical and thermal storage, flexible generation and controllable loads. You're going to hear from several of subject matter experts from across DOE program offices as well as the national labs with expertise in these different areas. All of that is included. I think I'll get into this a little bit more on the next slide, but really try to match the technologies with the market context and sort of real world context for what are the requirements and capabilities that the energy storage needs to be able to provide, and then starting from what the needs are and then working backward to figure out which technologies are most appropriate. We're including a number of different basically funding offices from across the department. So across energy efficiency and renewable energy, Office of Electricity. The national labs are not listed here, but we have strong engagement from, I think, all 17 of DOE's national labs. And across the bottom, just to make this point that it's going from basic science, basic research into materials, applied R&D, looking at what are the cost and performance targets required to see market adoption, what are the tools and analytical capabilities required to de-risk the technology so that the say electricity markets can be highly regulated. So what is the analytical capabilities that regulators need to understand the performance of energy storage, how to think of it from a system perspective, and really to think a lot about both the manufacturing and commercialization. I have counterparts from across DOE focused on the technology development side, manufacturing, workforce, policy considerations, and we're happy to connect any of you back to the appropriate people within the department that can answer your questions and help you. If you have a specific aspect of this that you're interested in, happy to connect you with those folks. So next slide. So I think kind of building on what I mentioned on the earlier, I think what is somewhat unique for DOE with regard to the Energy Storage Grand Challenge is the strong emphasis on use cases and thinking about what are the sort of market contexts and real world problems that energy storage can solve, and then working back from there to either identify current or technologies under development that can meet those needs. And so I think this is where, when I think about the context in which you operate, there are a number of different areas from grid decarbonization to serving remote communities, electrified transport, the sense of independent network infrastructure that has multiple interdependencies, and the role that storage can play in providing redundancy and reliability and resilient services. Critical services, so hospitals or facilities that require highly reliable electricity in a particular region or country, that energy storage could play a role. And this idea that the grid is evolving over time and that energy storage can help provide flexibility and efficiency. So the folks you're going to hear from today and others back at headquarters, what we're trying to do is say, well, these are the things energy storage needs to be able to do. What are the technologies we have under development, and how can we match those together and then identify real world projects? Say a hospital that's looking to deploy energy storage as a backup capability. How do we get that project built so that other hospitals or other facilities can see what value it can provide and get that accelerated technology adoption? Next slide. So one way that we've kind of framed what we're trying to do with the Grand Challenge is innovate here, make here, deploy everywhere. And so that's from a US context. So just basically to say, we're already doing a lot of research and development in this area. We're increasing that. There's increased engagement, increased funding and activity from both headquarters and at the labs, focused on new technologies, next generation technologies across the entire sort of DOE portfolio. And so we already do a lot of that. There's already a lot of intellectual property coming out, a lot of subject matter expertise, et cetera. How do we connect that with the manufacturing piece, the make here? So both, this is, I would say, an acknowledgement of the innovation that takes place in the manufacturing processes, to realize it's not just about developing new technologies, but the manufacturing innovations, the process innovations that can help reduce technology costs and increase performance, and just really calling that out as a discrete activity and area of focus. And then finally, and this is an area that we've, within our office, the Office of Technology Transitions, have really emphasized of deploy everywhere. And that's why I'm really delighted to speak with all of you, is recognizing the global nature of the global challenges, the global markets in which energy storage may be relevant. I think particularly that there may be use cases or technology requirements in different regions and countries where it may differ significantly from the US, and that so for instance, the department or one of the labs may be developing a technology that could be highly appropriate for a particular, say, emerging market or lesser developed country context. And we want to find that opportunity both to solve that problem, to have a positive impact, to have a benefit on human well-being. At the same time, get that technology out of the laboratory into the public domain, into the private sector, so it can have that positive impact. And so that's why we're happy to speak with all of you, and happy to have follow-ups, because a lot of this will get down to sort of the specifics of which technologies, as Danny alluded to, what are the specific technologies, what's an example where it's worked in maybe another region that you can learn from and apply it to another context. Next slide. So I just recommend, if you want to learn some more, in addition to today's session, you can sign up for updates on work that we've been producing. We have a number of different workshops. The website's listed here at the top. We've issued a roadmap last fall that has a lot of detail on different technologies and performance characteristics. We have a cost and performance report that Vince Sprinkle and others from Pacific Northwest National Lab have been instrumental in developing, that really lays out a lot of the technology characteristics, a market report that shows you kind of where the market is today, where it's headed. And we have sort of on a continual basis announcing new workshops, reports, etc. So feel free to visit that site. And then on my last slide is just my contact info. I'm happy to help. Sometimes it can be a bit daunting to know who is the right person to talk to. Next slide, please. And sometimes it can be a little daunting to figure out who is the right person to reach out to or connect with. I'm happy to help facilitate that. So if you can't figure out who to speak with, or you have other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to put you in touch with the right person. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again for the invitation. I think it's going to be a great discussion today, and turn it back to you, Tom.
Great, Stephen. Thanks so much. And I do want to highlight the great partnership that Stephen mentioned, and Danny as well, between climate investment funds and U.S. Department of Energy and the national labs within the U.S. Department of Energy complex today to help bring this meeting to you. So it's been fantastic, and we'll be hearing a lot more from representatives from the national labs and from U.S. Department of Energy folks today. Why don't we go to the next slide? I just want to talk a little bit about the agenda going forward. We've really structured this, as Danny was saying, to respond to some of the interest that we heard in May about energy storage technologies, but also the business case for those energy storage technologies. And so we'll be moving today essentially through 3 sessions, kind of building that base of knowledge and understanding. The first session that we'll be going into here in a moment is Ask the Experts. We have 3 experts from national labs in particular areas of energy storage. They'll help lay out kind of the spectrum of available and emerging energy storage technologies that are available, and really be answering questions that you all have for them about those technologies. After that, then we'll move more into the business case, and we'll be hearing from several experts who have built tools, frameworks, insights for understanding how do we evaluate which energy storage technology is right for a particular situation. So in some ways, for those who are working in the energy storage space, they'll be talking about things that should be in everybody's toolkit for evaluating energy storage options and kind of selecting the right technologies and helping to design the right types of projects. Following on that, we'll move into our 3rd session, which will essentially be our closing session. And this will be breaking out into smaller groups, but the focus for that will really be on insights from implementation. So we'll be hearing from people who are deeply involved in energy storage projects in the Maldives, in Thailand, in South Africa, in Chile, in Morocco, with insights from around the world on these projects, to be able to talk about how they have thought about customizing energy storage projects for particular countries, for particular regions, for particular facilities. And we really want to be able to engage participants as well in that discussion and draw in insights that others have from implementing energy storage projects around the world. When we get to that session, we'll be dividing into 2 groups, one more focused on battery storage and one more focused on long duration and utility scale storage. So be thinking now about which of those conversations you might most like to join when we move into that session. I do want to emphasize that we would love to have a great social media presence from today's meeting. The hashtag Keeping the Power On is the one that we are using and used in May as well. So for those of you who are active in social media, would encourage you to reference this hashtag today to bring attention to this work, and we'll chat that into the chat so people have that available. Maybe we can move to the next slide. All right, as you already know, we are using Zoom for the meeting today. I'm sure at this point it is very familiar technology for everyone. We will be recording this meeting, and the slides and the recordings will be available on the event website after the meeting. We'll be getting that information out to everybody when that's available. It looks like there's already some technology troubleshooting going on. My colleague Tess Wendell is on the line and available to help people with any technology issues. I think some of the sound issues that came up earlier have been resolved. So thank you, Tess, and thank you those who raised those questions. If feel free to chat Tess directly. Her email address is also here on the screen for people to follow up around any troubleshooting, and we can put that email address in the chat as well. Thank you everybody for staying muted. It's been great not getting background noise. Please feel free to have your video on or off. As we go into the breakout sessions, it'd be great if people were on video so we can see in particular who we're talking to there. One of the things we've noted with these meetings is there is often a really interesting dialogue going on in chat during the meeting itself. So I'd really encourage people to use that. If you have resources that you would like to share with folks, please put those in chat with links. If you're seeing people asking questions and you have some thoughts to help answer those questions, I encourage you to do that in chat as well. I mean, we're drawing on a huge base of knowledge here of the group that is participating today. All right, maybe we can go to the next slide. All right, in addition to using chat for communicating today, we will be using Slido. Those of you who participated in May are familiar with Slido. It's an application for doing polling and being able to ask questions in a forum like this. So what I encourage everybody to do now is if you have a phone or your browser is open, go to slido.com and we'll just do a little test here. When you get into Slido on your phone or in the browser, it will ask you to enter a code. And the meeting code for today is 708807, and that will connect us all together. We'll also get that Slido site and number into chat. There we go. So people can do that. One of the advantages for Slido, in addition to the ability to do some polling, which we'll get a chance to do right now, is that you can use it for Q&A. And for Q&A, the advantage is you can actually upvote questions. So if someone is asking a question and it's the same question that you have, you can upvote it and it will rise to the top. And that'll help us know when we get into Q&A and discussion where to focus our conversations. So hopefully people are starting to get into Slido, and we'll just give it a little bit of a test run here with a quick poll. Maybe we can move to the next slide. And the poll is, what city are you joining from? So we'd like to know where people are joining in from around the world today. For those of you who are in Slido, that poll should be popping up on your screen, and I see that we're starting to get a lot of answers here and realizing we have people participating from all around the world. So let's just give a few moments for people to enter your locations. All right, this is great. If you haven't already entered your location, please go ahead and do so. I think we can truly say we have a global meeting today, and we are tapping into people in time zones all around the world. So this is truly a day where some people are drinking coffee, some people are having lunch, and some people may be having an evening snack. So thank you all for joining in from around the world. So keep those coming in. It's great for us to know where everybody is participating from, but maybe we can move to the next slide and then we'll move into our next session. So the other aspect of Slido, which I mentioned, is this Q&A Q&A function, and that allows people to ask questions and upvote other people's questions. So hopefully folks are seeing that on Slido. What we'd like to do now is just seed the next conversation and also give people a chance for a little bit of practice with Slido. And under the Q&A, the question for you is really a question about questions, which is we are about to hear from several technical experts in various aspects of energy storage. What are the questions that you have for them? Maybe specific questions about battery chemistries, it may be particular questions about costs or fit for purpose for different sorts of situations. But I would encourage everyone to enter questions that you'd like these technical experts to address in this next session. And as you are hearing from them, keep those questions rolling in, because we'll have a chance to address those both in this session and those that come later today. All righty, so why don't we move on to the next slide. And what I'd like to do at this point is introduce our next session and the moderator for our session. This session, as I said, is the Ask the Experts time. We'll be hearing from several experts who will lay out a spectrum of information about energy storage technologies, and then have time for questions from all of you. And again, I invite people to use chat. If you're hearing questions and you have some thoughts or resources to share, please go ahead and use chat for that to share with this group. Alrighty, I would like at this point to introduce Lulu. Lulu, I'll let you introduce yourself and the session, and we'll move into that part of the program.
Great, thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with all of you today. My name is Lulu Lubo, and I work on various aspects of our work on clean energy and energy storage at the Climate Investment Funds. And we already know that the evidence is clear on the importance of energy storage for clean energy development. And as Danny mentioned, our energy storage program at the CIFS is intimately focused on this agenda. But even with this evidence, one of the things that came up during our previous event in May was the limited technical understanding on the characteristics of these technologies, how do they work, and what services do they provide to the grid or other energy use sectors. And so this is really the focus of this session. We want to hear from you and make sure that your technical questions get answered. And so I'm really delighted to be joined by 3 experts who will walk us through the mechanics of the different technologies. We'll try to focus more on emerging systems, as we certainly cannot cover everything in our limited time. But also, as we're focused on developing countries, we really want to focus our discussion on how these specific technologies may be suited for deployment in different market contexts. And so let me introduce our experts who I'm really honored to be in conversation with today. Our first expert is Dr. Vincent Sprenkel, who is the Senior Strategic Advisor for Energy Storage at Pacific Northwest National Lab. Vince is our expert on electrochemical storage or batteries, and he has been active in electrochemical technologies for over 25 years and currently holds 23 US patents on fuel cells, batteries, and high temperature devices with 22 pending patent applications. So very, very much well qualified to answer any question that you might have, and really delighted to have you with us here today, Vince. We also have Dr. Clifford Ho, who is a senior scientist at Sandia National Lab, where he has worked since 1993. And Cliff is our expert on thermal storage, although he has worked in several other areas, including solar energy, water safety, and sustainability, among others. And among his many career achievements, Cliff has authored over 300 scientific papers, holds 18 patents, and is a co-author and editor of 2 books. So also very well qualified, and wonderful to have you with us today, Cliff. And finally, we have Neha Rustagi, who is a technology manager leading the systems analysis and hydrogen infrastructure portfolios within the US DOE. Neha is leading some really exciting hydrogen-related initiatives in the Office of Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies within the US DOE. And she will be our expert on all questions related to hydrogen and their applicability in different contexts. And so Neha, really, really great to have you join us as well. And so let me now turn to some overview presentations from our experts. And so I'll ask Vince to really start us off and give us that overview on battery storage technologies. So over to you, Vince.
All right, thank you, Lulu. Hopefully I'm coming through all right. Yeah,
Yes.
So it's a pleasure to be with everyone today, here to focus on some of the battery technologies that we're seeing. Fundamentally, as you look at batteries, all that they have in common, basically there is a positive electrode or your cathode, a negative electrode or your anode, and some material in between that is used to help facilitate the charge transport between the two. And that's how you get the charge and discharge, and then storing the energy in those electrodes. And so that's fundamental to all battery chemistries. Now there's different configurations, different materials, and that's where you get the uniqueness and the diversity of chemistries that you can look at. If we go to the next slide. So, oh, sorry, next slide. So if you look at this chart, this is basically looking up on the y-axis, kind of the average discharge time of these batteries, while the bottom or x-axis is looking at the rated power of those systems. You can start to see the ranges that these battery systems today are operating. And again, I will point out these are flexible as technology developments happen. These ranges expand or move as things becomes cheaper. But you can generally see, we've got systems that are based upon zinc, and a lot of times utilizing earth abundant systems offers you a lower cost alternative. Lead acid's been around for 130 years and is still being utilized predominantly for transportation, but it was some of the early grid scale applications, and still potentially has areas it can improve into. One of the most dominant ones that we're seeing right now, and most people are aware of, is lithium-ion technologies. Has undergone significant cost reductions in the last decade in there, and is really kind of probably 90% of or more of what's being deployed on the grid today. But then you do have other technologies like flow batteries that are shown there kind of in green in their range that do tend to focus on longer duration. You do have a decoupling of the power and energy that gives you some enhanced flexibility. And then it's marked out there, the animation's not working in this, but that other one is sodium batteries, where you have like sodium sulfur technologies that are being deployed today. And so that just gives you a range. And as technologies are developed, what you see is a general push up and to the right of this, because as costs reduce, you are able to get basically more power, more energy for your dollar in there, and we're able to expand the range that we can actually use both in duration and power. I did want to point out there, you see that red open circle. We're still slowly starting to get into the range where some of the longer duration traditional type storage technologies like pump storage hydro, compressed air, and even hydrogen, where they really have a foothold. And so batteries are slowly making their way up there as costs come down and the technology improves, but still has some work to do to get up into that same range. Next slide, please. What I like showing this chart, so this has come from the DOE's Global Energy Storage Database, which I think there is a link down there. I think that link's actually on. But what's interesting about this is broken up again by power and duration. They're reversed on this one, but versus the different technologies of deployed systems. So this is hardware in the ground. And so if you look at blue, which is lithium-ion, and you can almost track this by time frame. So we saw the initial lithium-ion systems come onto the grid, typically being 15-minute, 30-minute assets. And so you see a focus at those time frames as those markets. In the US, that was the frequency regulation market that opened up a lot of opportunities for energy storage. As costs come down, you saw that shift from a 15-minute asset to a 30, to a 1 hour, to a 2 hour, to a 4 hour as a system now. So you can kind of mark that just through the deployments where you see that technologies. As you move left to right, you start to see less lithium ion, and you start to see the flow batteries come in. You start to see these sodium sulfur batteries come in that are kind of naturally a longer duration in that 4 to 6 to 8 hour type duration discharge in there, and sodium being highlighted by green, flow being highlighted by yellow. Just to kind of point out a few things in there too for context. If you look up there, the one I point out is the yellow circle. That is a Dalian flow battery, vanadium-based flow battery, probably one of the largest systems in there. But as you can see, recently became outpaced by the Moss Landing, California lithium-ion system at 320 megawatts in 4 hours of discharge duration. I also put a couple systems in there, the Bath County, Virginia pump storage hydro system, where it would show, and then basically off this chart, and then the Macintosh compressed air energy storage system where that would lie. And again, just trying to provide some context. So next slide, please. So as you look at this, and you know, as battery researchers, we are prone to every day from the research community hearing that the energy storage problem is solved. We've developed the next technology that's lower cost and going to work for everything. And it's important to realize that that's not the only factors that go into it. And so part of what we did, as Stephen mentioned earlier, is a cost and performance report that is part of the Energy Storage Grant Challenge. And it is trying to get a holistic view of this entire cost structure. And so if you look at this, you've got a storage block, or what's the most singular element you can track at this. For lithium-ion, you can look, if you look on the right, that may be the cell. And that's what you see in that picture is a traditional 18650 cell. But you take that cell, you put it into a pack. You take that pack, you put it with an HVAC system, the balance battery management system, a container, and you start to get a system. Then you have to take that system, you have to have engineering, procurement, construction, a project developer, and then you have to have a utility or someone else at this, or a subcontractor, integrate that into the grid. And all those build up into the cost structure to get to a final installed cost of the system. And that's really what we're trying to track, is what are the individual elements and what are the costs associated with those elements of that total installed system cost. And then how does the Department of Energy start tackling what are the R&D challenges we can solve to bring those costs down? But it also brings into effect the operating cost of these systems. And then one area that's highlighted here in yellow is the decommissioning cost. This is an area that's probably been underserved in battery technologies across all of them, whether it's lithium or vanadium. Lead acid actually has a pretty good idea in recycling and decommissioning. But I think this is something we've seen in the last few years take a larger focus, is trying to track that. So I put that website in. If you're interested in tracking that progress, you can go there and kind of see that breakdown and then see what the annualized and levelized costs are looking at. So when we start talking about cost, we're really focused on the levelized cost, not necessarily the CapEx. And so what we do is take that CapEx, take the operating cost, and then try to look at what's the break-even value that you have to have in order to make that storage work for you. And that's what's the break-even price of electricity coming out. And so if you look at the next slide, there it is, looking at and it should say levelized cost of storage. Again, keeping in mind what is the break-even point. Here you can see some differences between this as you're scaling from 1 megawatt to 10 megawatt system, looking at the levelized cost, and then you're seeing here systems ranging from 2 to 10 hours. And so here we see right now, current state of the art, we're seeing lead acid. While it has a low capital cost, initial capital cost, it is the levelized cost is limited significantly by the lifetime. Whereas you look at vanadium flow batteries, which are purple at the bottom, they may have a higher initial capital cost, but as you start looking at 20 to 30 year lifetimes on some of these systems, that really brings down the levelized cost of those systems. And so this is the type of information we're tracking, is terms of everything that goes into this levelized cost calculations, and how can we minimize that so to ensure that we get more storage on the grid. Next slide. And so with that, if you have other questions, I'd be happy to answer that. But there's my contact information, and again, another link to the cost and performance website. So thank you.
Thank you, Vince. We appreciate the very interesting overview. And you are right that we often forget about, looking at the cost from a very systems and holistic perspective. And I'm assuming, the cost structure that you're talking about could be applied to non-battery technologies. And it'll be interesting to see how those things compare. And so perhaps let me turn now to Clifford Ho, who will focus on thermal storage and how which could even be deployed at a larger scale for longer duration storage. So Cliff, over to you.
Thanks, Lulu. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Cliff Ho. I'm a mechanical engineer and senior scientist at Sandia National Laboratories. And in the next few minutes, I'll try to give a brief overview of thermal energy storage technologies. Next, please. So to put things into context, I wanted to show this next graph that shows sort of a growing need for large-scale energy storage. Next, please. So if you look at the axes here, what I'm plotting is the energy storage capacity. This is energy in megawatt hours. And I'm going to compare large-scale battery storage versus a couple thermal energy storage systems. These are concentrating solar power, or CSP plants. Now, the battery storage data is from 2018. Next, please. You can see at the end of 2018, there was just over 700 megawatt hours of large-scale battery storage. There were about 100 plants in the US of large-scale systems. Next, please. Now, if you take a look at just one concentrating solar power plant with thermal energy storage, the Crescent Dunes plant in Nevada, that had over 1,000 megawatt hours. And then next, please. If you look at the Solana concentrating solar power plant in Arizona, that had nearly 1.7 gigawatt hours, or 1,700 megawatt hours. So you can see the comparison of just individual CSP thermal storage plants with literally over 100 large-scale battery storage lithium-ion plants. Next, please. And if you look at a large city like Los Angeles or New York, the peak power requirements is on the order of about 10 gigawatts, or about 10,000 megawatts. So you need about 10,000 megawatt hours just to power a large city for 1 hour. Take a look at the numbers below there. You need a lot of energy storage just to power a large city for 1 hour. So I thought this did a nice job of putting things into context about large capacity, big energy storage systems that are going to be needed if we start going towards higher penetrations of intermittent renewables. Next, please. So with regard to thermal energy storage, next, please. There are three main categories of thermal energy storage. The first is sensible storage, or single phase storage. This is just using a temperature difference to store the heat in different media. You can use molten salts. That's what's conventionally used in concentrating solar power. And then you can also use solid storage media, such as rock, various particles, graphite, and you can take a look at the temperature ranges that each can accommodate. Next, please. The second category is phase change materials, where you're using latent heat of a phase change, either going from solid to a liquid or liquid to solid. And next, please. And then finally, there's thermochemical storage. This is less mature, but people have been studying ways to store the energy in chemical bonds. And this is nice because once it's stored in bonds, it can stay there for long durations. Next, please. I just want to give a couple examples of the first two, starting with sensible heat storage. Next, please. Molten salt storage is what's used conventionally in concentrating solar power. There's nearly 30 gigawatt hours deployed globally. The next image shows the Solana parabolic trough plant in Arizona. This has 6 hours at 280 megawatts capacity of storage. You can see the tanks there. There are 6 pairs of hot and cold molten salt storage tanks surrounded by a field of parabolic trough mirrors. Next, please. And then there's also the Crescent Dunes solar tower. You can see just a single but very large hot and cold storage tank there containing molten salt that has 10 hours of storage at 110 megawatt electric capacity. Next, please. An example of latent heat storage, next, is illustrated by Highview Power, a company that does liquid air storage. Basically use electricity when it's cheap, renewable electricity, when it's low price or being curtailed, to compress air and store it as a cryogenic liquid in large insulated silos. And when needed, that liquid is allowed to vaporize, which expands and spins a turbine to generate electricity. These systems have been demonstrated and used at about the they're trying for the 50 megawatt, about 400 megawatt hour scales. Next, please. And in summary, next, this final table just simply shows a comparison of various large scale, potentially long duration storage options, comparing the conventional pumped hydro that Vince showed earlier, and compressed air. A couple challenges with those are the requirement for unique geologic resources. But of course, pumped hydro, very mature technology. Hydrogen, this is we'll hear more about this from Neha next. Some of the challenges right now are cost and round trip efficiency. And then the thermal that I talked about, it is a mature technology in terms of concentrating solar power. Some of the challenges would be the cost of the heat exchanger, getting the heat back out of it, and then just and getting the heat in terms of concentrating solar power. The combined cost of CSP has been a bit higher, on the order of 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Excuse me, when you compare it to, say, photovoltaics and wind. And I think that's why it really hasn't taken off. A lot of these renewable portfolio standards have focused just on cost. So low cost electricity capacity options, and not really focusing on the energy storage capacity. But I think thermal has some good potential when you start looking at larger capacity, longer duration needs. Next slide. And yeah, this just shows where I work at the National Solar Thermal Test Facility. One more click, and that'll show where my office is next. That's where I work. So if you ever visit Albuquerque, I'd be happy to give you a tour. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you for that overview. I'm getting a bit of an echo. Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking about that example at the beginning of how much is needed to power New York, that was really striking, because I'm thinking most of the largest cities of the future will be in developing countries. And so thermal will have a very, very significant role to play. And I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the range of factors that should be considered by countries as they deploy large amounts of thermal storage on the ground. But for now, let me turn the conversation to hydrogen and welcome Neha Rustagi to talk to us about hydrogen storage and fuel cell technologies and their various applications.
Great. Thank you, Lulu. Let me try to share my screen. All right. So I'm going to be providing an overview of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies and the Department of Energy's activities in this space. So I'll start with a little bit of background. Sorry, here we go. So I'll start with a little bit of background. So fuel cell is a technology that takes hydrogen on one side and oxygen on the other side to produce water, and in doing so generates electricity. And then that electricity can be used to power anything from a building to a vehicle to a mobile handset. There's many different ways to make the input hydrogen. One of those pathways is through electrolysis. So electrolyzers are basically fuel cells operating in reverse. So you put water in and electricity in, and then as a result, produce hydrogen and oxygen. And then you can store that hydrogen and use it to make power whenever you need it. So if that hydrogen is being made with clean energy, then the life cycle emissions of hydrogen and fuel cell pathways are typically over 90% lower than that of other conventional alternatives, because the only direct output is water. So when we talk about hydrogen energy storage, what we're really saying is connecting an electrolyzer to a high renewable grid. And then when you have excess energy, using that to make hydrogen that gets stored in bulk. And then when you need power, drawing that hydrogen out and using it with a fuel cell to produce power back to the grid. Now, the benefit of this concept is that increasing the size of your bulk hydrogen storage is not that expensive. And so as a result, whether you're trying to store 2 hours or 5 hours or 50 or 500, the levelized cost of energy storage with hydrogen typically stays about the same. And so this is advantageous when you need long durations, like multiple days of storage, because it's at those longer durations that conventional technologies will increase in scale to the point that they aren't cost effective. And that's where hydrogen has a value proposition. At the shorter durations, like 4 hours or less, typically technologies like batteries will be cheaper because of the initial capital required for an electrolyzer, fuel cell, or bulk storage. But once you've paid off that capital, as you can see, the levelized cost of energy doesn't change much with time. So the other scenario where this has a value proposition is if you have other regional markets for hydrogen. So for example, if you have a metals plant or a transportation fleet that can use hydrogen, those markets can help pay off, for example, the electrolyzer. And that way it reduces the overall cost of energy storage, because the cost of these components isn't being borne only by the energy storage system, it's being shared with a bunch of other end uses. So to explore those integrations, DOE launched the H2 at Scale initiative. So this is an initiative aiming to enable clean hydrogen use across sectors, including energy storage, but also industrial applications like metals or chemicals, as well as heavy duty transportation. So this aligns with other administration goals like enabling 100% clean power by 2035. So the emissions associated with hydrogen use typically come from energy consumption. So if you have 100% clean grid, that would enable dramatic reductions in the life cycle emissions associated with hydrogen use. And then also, if you had 100% clean grid, those are the scenarios where you might need long duration energy storage. And like I was saying before, that's where hydrogen has a use case. Also, using clean hydrogen across many of the sectors that I was mentioning, like chemicals or steel, can facilitate enabling net zero emissions by 2050. So to put this all in perspective, today we produce about 10 million metric tons of hydrogen per year, and most of that hydrogen is produced from natural gas. And in that case, there is a release of CO2 unless it's captured and sequestered. But recently, there's been growing interest in clean hydrogen production. And one example would be in electrolysis. And this is really being driven by, kind of a global desire to decarbonize sectors that are hard to electrify. So for example, by 2030, over 40 gigawatts of electrolyzer deployments are planned to meet various national level targets. And you can see those plans have grown pretty aggressively over the past couple of years. Just a couple of years ago, the plan was closer to about 3 gigawatts, and now we're over 40. And in terms of funding, over $80 billion of funding from government sources have been announced on hydrogen and end use case demonstrations. And the private sector itself is planning a 6-fold increase in its funding in these spaces by 2025. So to leverage all these activities, the DOE works closely with international organizations like the International Energy Agency, the Clean Energy Ministerials, Mission Innovation, and then also the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, or IPHE. So IPHE comprises 13 different countries and the European Commission, and we work on their working groups related to regulations, codes, and standards. So there we're basically trying to collaboratively address pre-competitive barriers to hydrogen use, safety challenges, as well as education and outreach. And then we also work with their life cycle analysis task force, aiming to develop agreed upon ways to characterize emissions of hydrogen to allow for global trade. So safety is a priority for us. And so a few years ago, we worked with AICHE to launch the Center for Hydrogen Safety. So this is a fee-based center where members get access to safety resources, reduced rates at safety conferences, and then also to DOE's Hydrogen Safety Panel, which is basically this panel of industry experts and lab experts that can review safety plans before projects begin and answer safety questions. And it's been actually a really valuable resource for us at DOE. We use the safety panel with projects that we fund. And currently this center now has over 60 partners from all over the world. So recently, as many of you may have seen, the DOE's Secretary of Energy announced the first Energy Earthshot, which was the Hydrogen Energy Earthshot, to enable $1 a kilogram hydrogen in 1 decade by 2030. And this was based on what we think it'll take for hydrogen to be competitive across sectors. We've done preliminary analysis showing basically how low the cost of electrolyzers has to be and the cost of energy has to be to meet this target, but we are also soliciting feedback on demonstrations we can do and to other technologies we can pursue. So I'd ask you all to stay tuned for more information. We're planning a summit from August 31st to September 1st, and we should be releasing more information soon. And so with that, I want to close by putting up our website. If you sign up for our news alert, you'll hear more about the webinars that we plan, safety resources as we develop them, and then also our annual events like the annual merit review, which is a great way to learn more about our program. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Neha. Really, really interesting work that you're doing. And I'm sure many of our participants will be interested to attend or participate in some of the events that you mentioned. But now let me turn to the sort of the live Q&A session. But perhaps let me start off with sort of a broad question that was raised during our May event in terms of, of the technologies that we've sort of talked about today, what makes them well suited for developing country contexts where they might be perhaps unique policy, financing, or technical challenges, and perhaps provide one or two things that countries should consider if they're trying to deploy these technologies at scale. So maybe I'll start with you, Vince, on the battery side.
Yeah, thank you. So I do think, one of the things that why we've seen the growth all over for battery systems is they are dispatchable. We can build small containerized systems and move those in and place them, and you do not have the geographic constraints or anything else you may have with that. So that's been a huge advantage to the systems. The diversity of technologies has also been an advantage for batteries. Sodium sulfur batteries have operate at very high temperatures, and so because of that, they tend to be pretty insensitive to environmental factors. So if you're going into somewhere hot, it doesn't necessarily impact it like it may be a lithium-ion technology, which has to be kept cool. And so if you're in a hot area, you would need a lot of additional HVAC. So I think the diversity and just the scalable size of batteries have made them attractive deployment opportunities.
Okay. And Cliff?
Thanks, Lulu. I think the simplicity of a lot of the thermal storage technologies lends itself to local manufacturing, creation of the refractory lines, storage tanks, for example. Irradiance, maybe in Africa, having a large amount of direct normal irradiance is also a positive thing on performance. And certainly for thermal storage, just having the potentially regions of higher temperature, maybe less heat loss, of course, relative to depending on what temperatures you're getting up to, that may not be such an important role. But I think having workforce development, having local resources, all those things lend, the technology of thermal storage lends itself well to.
Okay. Okay, great. And Neha, just on hydrogen.
Thank you, Lulu. So I guess, the main value proposition for hydrogen technology is in sectors that are hard to decarbonize with electricity. So if you have markets that are hard to otherwise decarbonize, like for example, steel making or heavy duty transportation, those are places where deploying hydrogen technologies can be the lowest cost method of decarbonizing. And if you deploy all that capital like an electrolyzer, using it for long duration energy storage isn't necessarily as cost intensive as it otherwise would be. So in developing countries where there might be industrial sectors or chemical sectors or freight sectors that they're looking to decarbonize, I think hydrogen has a strong use case. And then the other application would be wherever you need long duration energy storage. So today, in the US, that's in high renewable grids, but in developing countries, if you're looking to set up microgrids, for example, where you're not really connected to a lot of other sources of reliability, long duration energy storage can be necessary. And that's a place, if you needed multi-day storage, that hydrogen could be the lowest cost option.
Okay. So I have one question here, which is talking about the waste issue. So which generates less and less harmful waste, battery or molten salt storage? So I guess, Vince, if you want to.
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, it depends upon the technology. And so each technology from a battery technology has different challenges in terms of waste streams. And so I think you have to look at that. We've seen lead acid industry where it is, there's issues with it, but they have figured out ways to make that what they say 96% recyclable in there. Whereas I think with lithium-ion, you're still looking at the opportunities to make that a viable pathway. Vanadium flow batteries, you're seeing people, basically after 20 years of using it in a battery, that vanadium solution can go into the steel making process. And so, I think these are what people are really starting to look at is the end of life and how do you minimize that downstream. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in this area for battery systems, looking at that environmental impacts.
And I'd like to add, that's a great question, Anjana. There are some papers, you could just do a Google search on environmental impacts, energy storage. There's a lot of studies on batteries, and Vince mentioned it's very technology dependent. For thermal storage, what's interesting is with a CSP concentrating solar power plant, a lot of the materials are salvageable. That's really one benefit. So when you take a look at the total life cycle, that is another benefit of CSP. With regard to the material itself, molten salt, fairly inert. We're looking at particles, looking at literally sand, so just dirt as this heat transfer and storage media. So from that perspective, there have been studies comparing across thermal storage and batteries, and the impacts of thermal storage are very, very low relative to other energy storage technology.
Okay. So I would assume, though, there would be a higher upfront cost for thermal compared to the battery. I guess that would be the big challenge. But let me turn to two other questions before I turn to my colleague. The first that we have is, what is the levelized cost of energy per kilowatt hour for 4 hours of storage, I guess, for each of your different technologies? And also, how can we measure the state of charge of a molten salt battery? So who wants to start off? Yeah.
I'll start off on levelized cost for a lot of the battery technologies. I would say today you're probably in that on average about 40 cents per kilowatt hour for a 4-hour system is where you're at with the ultimate goal. I think someone posted just recently the DOE's ultimate goal of trying to drive this down towards 5 in there. So still a lot of ways to go. But I would say on average that's kind of where it is. And that's probably about double where a pump storage hydro system would be. Of course, those are longer durations than 4 hours at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, and those are similar numbers. I typically think of at least 20 cents to, as Vince said, 40 cents for the entire battery system. And this is another opportunity for thermal is the low cost, and especially the low marginal cost when you start to increase in capacity. The CSP plants that are being deployed today are on the order of about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay, 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, the reason it hasn't taken off is because it's being compared against just generating units of like PV or wind, which is now what, 3-4 cents per kilowatt hour, even lower utility scale, but that doesn't have storage. So when you tack on the battery, as Vince just said, that's when you got to make the apples to apples comparison. So if you have the right conditions, high solar irradiance, I think solar thermal, concentrating solar power from a cost perspective is very competitive.
Okay, very interesting. And Neha?
So I guess for hydrogen, it's highly dependent on the cost of electricity. So if you assume 2 cents a kilowatt hour electricity, which is very low cost, but if you had that, then somewhere between 20 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. But I'll also plug, we worked with a few other DOE offices to create a public model, which I can share in the chat, called StoreFast, where a user can input their own electricity price and then run and see what many of the different technologies, including thermal, battery, hydrogen, and others, would cost over various durations of time. So that can be a useful way to compare depending on the regime that you're looking for.
Okay. That would be really useful to share those resources. So let me see if my colleague Sarah has any additional questions coming in as well on Slido.
Yeah, thanks, Lulu. So just a quick reminder to everyone, if you are submitting questions via Slido, there's an option there to upvote. So if anyone wants to, particularly wants to hear an answer to any question, you can go ahead and upvote those. So the one that we see now that has the most votes is, what degradation rates is DOE seeing in batteries used for long duration storage, particularly C4?
Yeah, and so that's actually a good question and a very difficult one to ask. It really depends upon the usage pattern that we're seeing, the depth of discharge of the battery. And so all those factors going in and determining the degradation rate. What we're doing across a lot of DOE is using a standardized set of use cases that we can test these battery systems against, so we can get that comparison in degradation rates. And so I can provide some information. There's some DOE, what are called test protocols, like for a typical peak shaving application. And so we are testing there, and the different technologies, depending on where you're operating and at, does come differently. So sorry, I can't give you a definitive answer, but it does very much depend upon how you are utilizing the battery and how much of that battery capacity you are using. So.
Okay. Anyone else want to add, or Sarah, do we have any other questions coming in?
Yeah, we have quite a few actually.
Okay.
So the next one.
So maybe we can, sorry to cut you off, maybe we can
yeah.
have like 2 or 3, and then we can have the experts answer them at the same time.
Sure. So you want a couple of questions?
Yes.
Great. So the next most highly rated are how many of the batteries are coming from China, and is the supply chain secure? And then also, what will be the most sought after material in the future for energy storage?
That's quite a challenging one.
So in terms of battery supply chains, I think this is something every country that produces batteries struggles with, is ensuring that they have access to those sources. And so I think you're seeing, not, in the US and other countries, like for example, on lithium-ion. We know the lithium resources are constrained. They're coming from certain sources today. But what R&D is looking at is, for lithium, can I take that and replace it with a sodium ion, and basically switch the lithium out to something that any country can get anywhere in terms of sodium. And so those are some of the efforts that are going on. Everyone is really striving to get to those earth abundant technologies that do not have those supply chain constraints. But yeah, this is an issue whether you're looking at the lithium, you're looking at cobalt, you're looking at vanadium for flow batteries. All those issues come up in terms of, are you going to have access to those materials? And manufacturers struggle with that every day.
I guess
So, go ahead, Neha.
For hydrogen, the analogy would be platinum. So platinum is used as a catalyst in electrolyzers and fuel cells. And similarly, we fund research to either reduce or replace platinum loading. So that would be, I guess, the critical material that's of interest within the hydrogen space.
Okay. And Cliff, do you have anything to add to that?
The materials for thermal storage or concentrating solar power, again, are very abundant. Everything is salvageable. The typical media, salts, very abundant. We're looking again at even lower cost, higher temperature range, solid particle sands, and other things that are, again, dirt cheap and very abundant.
Okay. So I guess to add on to this question before I go back to Sarah, so do you see any sort of interactions between the different technologies? Are they best operated, exclusively, or are there synergies that countries can kind of leverage? For example, they could probably look at batteries as a starter technology and then transition to thermal. What are you kind of seeing in the market right now? Anyone can answer that. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of synergy. So, like I was saying, like in the US, the market for energy storage right now is largely like 4 to 8 hours would be actually probably the upper end of what the market demands today. And in that space, batteries are the lowest cost option here. But in scenarios where you needed long duration energy storage, and that could be different in other countries, that's where, hydrogen has a use case. And also, in parts of the world where there might be like hubs of industry that you're looking to decarbonize, that's where hydrogen has a use case. So I think that's the synergy. And to put this in perspective, I guess one of the use cases we've been looking at is integrating electrolyzers with the grid in parts of the country where there's fast charging deployment for electric vehicles, because when you have rapid power draw from the grid and kind of instability, that's a place where electrolyzers can kind of help balance load. So that's one way where we've kind of already been exploring hybridization schemes. And even on like fuel cell trucks, for example, typically there's a battery and a fuel cell kind of playing complementary roles. So.
Yeah, I'm a strong supporter of hybrid energy storage systems. When you're talking about timescales, ramp rate, lithium-ion batteries for the 4 to 6 hour needs, and as Neha said, when you start to get beyond that, looking at other bulk storage options, whether it's pumped hydro, thermal, hydrogen chemical storage for the longer term, I think that's a great combination. I'll put in a plug though, in terms of integration. There is a novel way to also create hydrogen, not only from electrolysis, but also from conversion, basically from steam stripping using concentrated sunlight, reducing particles again, and then subsequently oxidizing them. There's a chemical looping process where you can also produce hydrogen. DOE has supported this solar thermochemical generation of hydrogen.
Wow, very interesting. I hope, I'm sure there's resources for that as well. So really interesting technologies. Sarah, do we have anything else coming in before we kind of try to wrap up the session?
Yeah, I think the next couple that it would be nice to address, and I'll just read them both out, are, so what are good technologies for sub-Sahara, so hot and remote areas? And then also what technology is really competitive at large scale with lithium-ion?
So I think, in terms of scale, in lithium-ion is probably closer to being at scale than hydrogen or thermal energy storage. But when you get to economies of scale, I think every technology sees, it's not identical, but a similar learning curve, like 40 to 50% reduction in cost, I think is typical across the board. In terms of sub-Saharan Africa, I might defer to Cliff. I think that might be a good. I think that, presuming that, substantial solar and thermal energy resource, that might be a technology that's best suited for that space.
Yeah, I would agree. I think depending on the climate, the higher temperatures might be conducive to hot thermal storage. High solar irradiance is good. And I think, let's see, what was the first part of the question? Besides sub.
Yeah. So there was what are the good technologies for sub-Sahara hot and remote areas?
And the second one.
And then what technology is really competitive at large scale with lithium-ion?
Oh, right. I wanted to mention, just to emphasize that it's important to remember that when you start looking at bulk storage options, that depending on the cost of the media, the marginal cost of increasing that capacity, that scale, is really advantageous. For thermal in particular, if you're using materials that are very, very low cost, that means if you increase in capacity, you get economies of scale, not only in terms of the cost, because it's very low cost material that you're just adding into the bulk storage system, but it's an increase in performance actually in terms of storage, in terms of heat loss. The larger your system is, the larger your containment is, the surface area to volume ratio goes down. So your relative heat loss also goes down. So you get economies of scale both in performance and cost.
Okay.
I was just going to add a little bit, especially as you look at hot climates. I alluded to this earlier, like sodium sulfur batteries that operate, their operating temperature is 350 degrees C, so they're naturally hot. They work well because they're insensitive to it. Whereas, it's really important as you're looking at that kind of the ambient conditions, because if you have a technology that is very cheap in there, but it has a very tight operating window, you're going to be very tied to your air conditioning system that you have in the container or the building or whatever, and that's going to go into your operation and maintenance cost of a battery storage system. It also becomes your primary failure mode. In most battery systems, if the HVAC system shuts down, your battery is shut down also. So I think that's an excellent question, something to consider as you look at the system holistically in terms of what that's going to, pressure that's going to put on your HVAC system to maintain those battery systems. So I do think that is something you really got to look at in there. Really good point.
Okay. Thank you so much for, I think we could keep on going, and we have so many questions coming in from the chat and also from Slido, but we don't have enough time, unfortunately, because we have to move to our next session. But I think quickly, just, going around the room, I just want to sort of ask one last question. So assume that you're standing in an elevator with a government official in a developing country who is interested in implementing one of your technologies. So in 30 seconds or less, what one piece of advice would you give this official as they navigate this area of work? Just quickly around the room before we close. So maybe Vince, I'll start with you.
put me on the spot here first. Yeah. No, it's a good question. And, I think from the battery technologies, we understand the technology, it's developed, it is dispatchable, it's flexible, but it is really making sure that you understand what you need that storage system for. And knowing the end use, you can go back and get an optimal solution, whether that's simply a battery system or a hybrid or stuff. It's knowing the end game of what you need and using that to start speccing out the technical requirements of your storage system.
Okay. Cliff?
I think for thermal storage systems, I would advocate that if you're looking for larger capacity, longer duration systems, looking at a bulk storage system like thermal can be advantageous and very cost effective. It uses local materials, you can use local workforce, and it also has the added benefit of using existing spinning turbo machinery, which has additional stability advantages on the grid. You're basically using thermal heat to spin a turbine for the power generation, and that can be advantageous as well.
Okay, and finally, Neha?
For hydrogen, I'd say to look for regions where you have multiple use cases for the hydrogen. So aside from energy storage, but also industrial applications. And then secondly, to look at regions where you have access to low cost renewables or any low cost energy for long periods of time. One of the biggest cost drivers for hydrogen energy storage is the cost of energy. So if you have parts of the world where there is access to low cost renewables, for extended periods of time, that's where hydrogen has the strongest play.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you again. I would again encourage each of you to we have a lot of questions coming in the chat. So if you're able to answer some of them, we would really appreciate that as well. But I think for now, this is a really good way to start off the day. And so now I guess I'll turn it over to Tom to let us know what's happening next. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you, Lulu, and thank you, Neha and Vince and Cliff. And as Lulu mentioned, there are some additional questions in chat. So I would encourage any of our experts who can answer those via chat going forward. That'd be great. And I see that other people are already answering each other's questions. So that's great. Please keep that coming. And as we roll through additional speakers this morning, I think we'll be able to address some of the additional questions that have come up. So what we'd like to do now is just take a little bit of a break. It'll be a little shorter than planned. I'd like to start again at 30 minutes after the hour, depending on where you are in the world. So we'll take about a 6-minute break or so. For those who would like to stick around, we have a short video on energy storage. We'd invite you to watch that. The videos will also be available on the event site after the meeting. So if people want to take their break rather than watch the video, you can always go back after the meeting and check those out. So let's return at 30 minutes after the hour, and we'll hear some more about the business case and tools and frameworks for thinking about the business case for energy storage.
Renewable energy is on the rise. Solar panels, wind farms, and other clean technologies are more affordable than ever before, and the costs keep coming down. Governments are enacting smarter energy policies, and investors are paying attention. But renewable sources of energy, like wind and solar power, only provide electricity if there is wind or sunlight. We don't put our lives on hold when the wind stops blowing or when the sun stops shining. So how do we make renewable energy available when people need it? How do we provide clean power around the clock and help close the global energy access gap? The solution is energy storage. Energy storage technologies, such as batteries, can be deployed around the world to get more renewable energy on the grid more quickly and efficiently. This is especially important in developing countries where nearly 1 billion people still live without electricity. It's a growth industry with the potential to improve millions of lives. While storage prices are still relatively high, Concessional finance, such as that provided under the Climate Investment Fund's new Global Energy Storage Program, will help lower investment risk and develop new energy storage markets to the benefit of communities around the world. A renewable future is possible. Energy storage will get us there faster.
All righty. Why don't we go ahead and get started again? Hopefully everyone had a chance to take a little break. All right. So what we want to do now is move into thinking not just about energy storage technologies, but some of the aspects of those energy storage technologies and the kind of value that they can add for systems, and how to analyze fit for purpose for different energy storage technologies. And so we're going to move into a discussion now of some key tools and frameworks for thinking about the energy storage business case, and really a set of resources that anyone working in the energy storage space should have in their toolkit. So I'll turn it over now to Danny Morris with Climate Investment Funds for Danny to introduce both this session and the speakers that we'll be hearing from. Danny?
Thanks, Tom. I really enjoyed that last session. Those kind of really interesting conversations get the small utopia gland in my brain fired up and thinking about what can the world look like if we make the right choices. But then that gland is connected to the realistic part of my brain, which is like, how do we actually make these things happen? And so with that in mind, we've designed this panel to help you all sort of walk through the steps of what building a business case for energy storage can look like. So we're going to start with thinking about the framework, and a framework for valuing energy storage in context. And for that, we're going to turn to Roland Roche, who is the Deputy Director and Innovation for the Innovation and Technology Center at the International Renewable Energy Agency. After that, we're going to turn to Vinod Siberi, who is with the Grid and Research Development Division at US DOE, to talk about some very tangible tools that you can use to value different types of energy storage to help build the case. Following Vinod, we'll turn to Belen Gallego, who is the co-founder and CEO of ATA Insights, who has a lot of tangible experience in building this business case. She can talk us through what that looks like and how the process works for someone from the perspective of someone who's done it a number of times. And then thinking about the entirety of the business case, we'll then turn to Brittany Westlake, who is the Senior Technical Leader at the Electric Power Research Institute, to think about some issues that have already come up in conversation, which is life cycle of storage assets, and how do you recycle certain materials, and thinking about the entirety of your asset and its life and what you do with sort of end of life. So a really great panel that we're looking forward to hearing from. So let's start off with Roland. Please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Danny, and thanks a lot, Tom, also for having me here on behalf of the International Renewable Energy Agency to talk about the IRENA electricity storage valuation framework. I'm Deputy Director of the Innovation and Technology Center, and storage is very important, because as an agency that has a mandate to do the global energy sector transformation on behalf of its membership of 162 countries, storage is extremely important for us. And we are really interested to make storage work, because storage, electricity storage, is the bottle where we fill in the renewable energy. And let's say, as a renewable energy agency, we have the mandate to accelerate the deployment and the integration of electricity. Just to check, you can see my slide deck? Yes. Okay. So I just go to the next slide. 1 second. Yes. So the storage is the key flexibility option to integrate variable renewables in the 1.5 scenario. And from where we are coming at the moment, globally, we have 1.1% of electricity in the energy system. And with the energy sector transformation, we will go towards 51% of electricity in the energy, 51% of electricity in the energy system. So electricity is becoming more important, and to achieve a 1.5 scenario with 51% of total energy consumption will be electrified and supplied by 90% of renewable energy. So very important to say, we are going in a direction where we clearly see more electrification in the system, and that while we have more wind energy generation, we have more solar in the system, and then storage is inevitably important to make this system working. And for this, IRENA is very keen to help to support, let's say, countries, but also private sector and other stakeholders of electricity storage to understand the value of electricity storage in an energy system. And there it is very important to understand that in the transition, so we are coming from a fossil fuel-based system, and we are now moving to a system where, let's say, higher shares of renewables will be in the system, and the revenue schemes, so the tariffs to create revenues and to value storage in the system is not really part of this new energy system we are having. And that makes it very difficult to evaluate the value of storage in the combination with renewable energies when you integrate the storage into a system in combination with any renewable energy source. To my next slide, please. So you see here cases, and you see here a case where you look by a project, an integration of a project with renewable energy and storage. And let's say, looking here at the storage case, you see the project cost and you see the project revenues. And let's say, doing the comparison here, let's say on a project by project basis, you see that the economic viability is not very attractive. So the costs are for the project are higher than the project revenues, and so you have an economic viability gap. And this is what you see even with established and depreciated pump hydro storage in Europe. Let's say that the operation and maintenance cost of pump storage in many of the systems, so pump storage from Switzerland or Austria or some German cases, they are loss making. And that has something to do that many of the benefits that are related to the electricity, to the electricity storage are not properly evaluated under the current evaluation scheme. And if we want to have more renewables in the systems, if we want to decarbonize the energy systems, and if we want to get it done, that we get the energy sector transformation done, then we need to have energy storage in the system. And this requires a different way of thinking in how you evaluate certain components of energy storage in an approach that looks at the comprehensive and integrated value that is created by storage. Can you tick once again on the slides? Yes, so some system benefits of energy storage cannot be monetized based on existing regulation. And the goal is to identify the economic viability gap between monetizable project revenues and project costs, ensuring revenues are equal or higher than project costs by monetizing the system level value. And you see here, let's say that, for instance, ancillary services and cost savings, but also certain parts of the fuel cost savings, of entire system savings for the entire operation and maintenance of the energy systems are saved, but also transport and distribution deferral is kind of not considered by looking into the valuation of the entire system. And let's say this problem has to be solved. Otherwise, we will not be able to overcome this challenge in the path of the energy sector transformation, where the electrification and storage is so important. Next slide, please. Can you tick the next slide? Yes. So the key is to stack the revenues by providing different services in parallel. So electricity storage is capable of providing a variety of services to the grid in parallel, not only to the specific project. The understanding of the landscape of value opportunities is the first step to develop the assessment of methodologies. And IRENA is working on those methodologies to better evaluate the entire value of the storage that is entered into the energy system, and what is the value the storage is providing to the entire energy system and not only to the specific projects. So, and markets should be redesigned in order for electricity storage to be able to monetize system benefits from providing different services. And here, let's say, as an intergovernmental organization, IRENA has a role to provide the best knowledge and methodologies to the policymakers and to the regulators to better understand all aspects of the value that a storage system adds to the entire energy system. And you see here in those boxes, the red ones are electricity storage services that we are able to currently evaluate properly, and they are already part of the IRENA valuation, storage valuation framework, but there are still values that are very difficult to evaluate and make them part of the entire system, the value of the system that is added by the storage. And to mention here, that is the voltage support, that is the black start support is very difficult to evaluate, the distribution upgrade deferral, the voltage support on the distribution and infrastructure service side, but also customer energy management services on evaluating the real value of power reliability and the aspects of demand side management. The next slide, please. So what I clearly see here is, and what I say is, the entire evaluation, how you evaluate storage in the system needs a rethinking, and the regulator, policymaker, but also all the utilities have to understand this different approach. And with the IRENA methodology here, very in brief, because my speaking slot is quite brief, it is important to identify the need for an electricity storage service to support the integration of variable renewables. And then the key element of this methodology of the valuation framework is that you map all the impacts that come from the storage technologies with its identified services to the entire system. And then you look at these values that are provided, and then you analyze the system value of electricity storage compared to alternative flexibility options. So looking at the storage options on other flexibility options, valuing all the services that are added by the storage to the system, and that then weighing up what is the best approach in the short term, mid-term, and longer term that you add with your storage system. Then you, and we have a simulation model there, then you simulate the storage operation and stacking of revenue to see what is in the current system coming out. And based on this, you assess the viability of the storage system you want to choose, and then you manage and see if there is a possibilities to close this gap that I have described between the value you add with the storage system and the tariffs that are in the system. And you probably have to discuss with the utility, with the regulator, and also with the policymakers, at least at the beginning of the integration of variable renewables and the storage to go this way to convince the stakeholders of such a storage system. Next slide. It's the recommendations for different stakeholders. So for electricity storage developers, you get familiar with existing business models, and you collaborate closer with regulators and utilities to highlight the system benefits. That is what I said already. You have to speak and discuss with all stakeholders and convince them from the roots what value you add with your storage project you are planning. You have to look for vertical integrated utilities perspective, where, let's say, the value of the storage system is not coming in each step of the value chain. You have to have a planning tool that includes energy storage and an update from the procurement process size, or also alongside all the services that are required. And you have to have this integrated approach in a utility that is basically unbundled. For the regulators, important here to eliminate and to help, and this is what we do. We speak as IRENA with policymakers and regulators to eliminate the barriers for energy storage participation in the different markets, and we try to help to design new markets able to capture the value of energy storage in the tariff system and make an incorporation of least cost planning for energy storage mandatory to distribution and transmission companies. And then very important, specifically on what we are doing in trying to catch the values that are added to the system by energy storage. We are in discussion with all kind of academia and researchers in how the values and the costs can be better distributed, let's say, for the different storage systems. This is my last slide, and I'm coming to the end. I invite you to have a look at the electricity storage valuation framework. And also very important is our IRENA Flex tool. This is a tool where we look at the capacity, the resources in the country, and the potential to transfer the country to renewable energy sources, where not only the dispatch is important, where also the flexibility aspects are important. Thanks, that was my presentation. I'm happy to give back to Danny, and I hope that was interesting for you. Thank you all.
Roland, thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. I really appreciate you spotlighting at the beginning that there are many ancillary uses for storage, and storage in different energy systems really requires a more holistic approach, which I think is really valuable. So for the thought exercise we're doing here, let's imagine ourselves to be this imaginary decision maker. Maybe it's for the vertically integrated utilities that you mentioned, Roland, but we've done our homework and we've started to figure out what some of those ancillary benefits of storage are. Now we want some tools that can help us really start to understand the role that storage can play and quantify some of those values that you spoke of. And for that, let's turn it to Vinod to talk about some of the toolkits that Department of Energy has developed. Vinod, please take it away.
Thanks, Danny. Can you hear me all right?
Loud and clear.
Great. So my name is Vinod Saiberry. I'm in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity, where I serve in the Advanced Grid Research and Development Division in support of our grid storage program. My presentation today, you can go to the next slide. My presentation today will be about an ongoing effort here at DOE to create what we are currently referring to as a model selection platform, or MSP. In short, the MSP is an ongoing effort with Pacific Northwest National Lab to create an interactive, publicly available tool that helps interested stakeholders better understand the value proposition presented by energy storage. Some good background on why something like this is necessary comes from the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, which was mentioned previously. It's a DOE-wide working group made up of multiple R&D offices, and they crafted a strategy roadmap document with the goal of ensuring U.S. success in deploying energy storage. One quote that highlighted the need for our tool pretty well reads as follows: "We need more information to effectively plan for and operate storage, both within the power system alone and in conjunction with transportation, buildings, and other industrial end uses, and how the different services storage provides can be fairly valued and compensated in a way that incentivizes technologies and projects that provide greatest value to the energy system and its end users." So in addition, the 6 use cases listed here: facilitating grid decarbonization, serving remote communities, electrified mobility, interdependent network infrastructure, critical services, and facility flexibility, efficiency, and value enhancement, were also included to show what types of things that high-performing, low-cost energy storage can enable. And so even though this strategy was created with the needs of the U.S. in mind, some of these use cases are greatly aligned with the goals of developing nations. Specifically, can include, the facilitating grid decarbonization, the serving remote communities, and the critical services use case. So you can go to the next slide, please. So how do we effectively analyze the value of energy storage? The challenge is that we have to consider a use case or combination of use cases that energy storage is capable of serving, and then be able to properly analyze both directly and indirectly captured value streams. Looking at this table on the slide, you can see the things that I'm referring to as either direct or indirect. So on the left here, these directly captured or often market-based value streams include things like ancillary service, energy and capacity markets, and independent system operator or regional transmission organizations that are typically found covering a lot of the US. And then as well as electric bill savings coming from time of use and demand charge savings. On the right, you can see what these more indirectly captured value streams are. So you have things like the value of deferred investment on transmission/distribution infrastructure, and then the value of power reliability and the value of lost load during outages. So to address the complexities of this value stacking, stakeholders will typically use an energy storage valuation model or tool, which can be defined as the following. There's software programs that can capture the operational characteristics of an energy storage system and and use forecasts, data, and other inputs related to information about available value streams to determine the optimal dispatch and estimate the value provided by a system. So the operational characteristics and capabilities of energy storage technologies can be quite different from each other. Just think about the sort of design differences between batteries versus a flywheel or pumped hydro system. The main function of a valuation tool is to use mathematical techniques that factor in both system characteristics and information on value streams to determine the optimal dispatch and maximum attainable value for the system. Certain tools can also be used to inform siting and sizing of systems that achieve maximum value. You can go to the next slide. So now we'll look at some DOE-supported value analyses. Our grid scale R&D program provides funding typically to our DOE national labs to complete reports that analyze the value of energy storage in different use cases. Although all of these are in the US, the last three on this list I thought might have some specific aspects that would be of interest to the international community. So I'm not going to go super in depth with this first one, but this one is the Beacon Power Hazel Township flywheel. And this study looked at the maximum revenue potential of a flywheel plant participating in PJM and their frequency regulation and any energy arbitrage market. So the next one, Sterling Municipal Light Department study. This one was carried out by Sandia National Labs. And I thought this would be a valuable one to highlight for this group, as they looked at the value of resilience added by an energy storage system, which could sort of be seen as a universal need for a lot of communities around the world. The utility, in this case, identified 10 kilowatts of critical load needed to maintain first responder operations. This study uses a value of lost load estimate done by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which essentially conducted surveys and cost analysis to help utilities understand what the economic value of not being able to deliver power is. The study estimated that the storage system could provide savings of an estimated $40,000 per outage event. So moving on to the next one, the Nantucket Island study, which was carried out by Pacific Northwest National Lab. So this is a really interesting case for island communities that are connected to a mainland grid. And it's an example of how storage can allow for a resilient and economic solution for communities across the world who are in a similar situation. Nantucket Island, located off the coast of Massachusetts, receives most of its power from two submarine cables connected to the mainland grid. So the report analyzed the value of, or basically compared the value of adding a battery system versus investing in another undersea cable to ensure adequate supply during a contingency event where one of the existing cables would go offline during a period of peak demand, in this case during the summertime. So the report estimated that an energy storage system combined with an upgraded gas turbine on the island would cost about $93 million, but it would defer almost $110 million in spending on a new undersea cable and provide an additional $12 million in outage mitigation over a 20-year span. And the last one is the Hawaiian Electric report on a behind-the-meter storage tool. This was carried out by PNNL. So this was a good analysis for the use of behind-the-meter storage in island communities and to sort of address how to properly incentivize customers to procure energy storage. And basically, it's a tool that helps users understand how a storage and PV system can create customer value from savings on electric bills, credits for excess energy given to the grid, and be used to evaluate different types of demand response incentives that could potentially be implemented by a utility. So you can go to the next slide. So this is where I'll sort of wrap up. Now that we've seen a few examples of how to go about valuing energy storage, I'm going to quickly highlight some of these DOE-created tools that are free and made available to the public, and then wrap up this presentation by exploring how our model selection platform is going to help those interested in the valuation of energy storage make best use of these tools. So the list is on the left here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about each of them, but I did provide links. So just to end with what the MSP actually is, an easy way to think about it is through a black box framework. Our goal is to have eventually a website interface where users can enter information about their storage use case and select a few preferences. And then it would feed into the platform and would then output and would tell a user which tool out of this list would be best suited for their needs, as well as lead them to additional resources. A parallel effort to the design of the platform is an accompanying report, which will provide an explanation of the tools and how they work, as well as underlying assumptions that inform how the platform makes decisions. The report will also include some examples of studies conducted on different energy storage use cases, similar to the 4 I showed earlier, and also outline a few more in-depth analyses of selected use cases where we focus on how they're represented in the tools. It's my sincere hope that a platform like this could serve as a valuable asset to a variety of stakeholders that are interested in the field of energy storage, and enable people to take advantage of these powerful analytical tools that DOE has developed. So this pretty much concludes my presentation. Thanks so much, and happy to answer any questions you all have.
Great, Vinod, thanks so much. Really useful overview of some of the powerful tools that are out there, and hopefully people can begin to use them to build the business case. Let's move on to what it looks like to actually build the business case for our thought experiment. If our imaginary official now has done the legwork, understands the framework, how they want to use storage, has used the tools to understand what storage options make the most sense for them. Now they have to put it together and make a compelling case. So for that, let's turn to Belén Gallego to share her insights on having done this previously in the areas of with experience in CSP and storage, especially in North Africa and a couple other places. Belén, please share your experience.
Thank you very much, Danny. Hello, everyone. My name is Belén Gallego, and I'm the CEO of ATA Insights, which is a business intelligence company focusing on renewable energy, storage, hydrogen, and decarbonization. And I'm going to talk to you about building the business case. You have heard a lot about technology, about modeling, so I'm not going to go into that in a lot of details. My colleague speakers have done a great job, and I think they're experts in those topics. But I'm going to focus a little bit on the points that you need to consider when you are bringing together the business case. And we're going to start with the most obvious item, which is the fact that the energy transition has changed radically the way that you need to think about our energy system. I'd like to ask for the next slide, please. And the first fact is the fact that has already been hinted by other speakers, is the fact that planning is now your biggest challenge as a utility, a government, a policymaker, and you need to focus on how you plan. It's your biggest challenge because it's changed completely the way and your mindset around the grid. So next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So traditionally, the way that you thought about energy was really you focused on demand. How much demand do I have? And that is what is at the center of planning. Planning pretty much consisted on acquiring and burning as much fossil fuels as required and when required, so that you could meet the demand. There are many negative externalities to the system, but the fact is that the spinning reserves and the grid services were totally taken for granted and very rarely paid. Therefore, there is a one-axis planning where you're only thinking about demand. However, in this new energy planning, what you need to think is in two axes. You are thinking on demand, but you're also thinking on resource, which is your natural resource. Because you have to match these two, as a planner, you need to think about across the two axes, and what you end up doing is you end up plotting in that chart the different technologies and how they can help you. Therefore, in order to create a system that works with this big change, you start putting the resources that you have and when you have them. The right side of this is that renewables technologies are very plentiful and they're very cheap. Cheap because the fuel is free, and not only is free, but it produces no CO2. However, it does pose a challenge for planners because availability doesn't necessarily coincide with demand. And this is where the mindset shift needs to happen. Can I have the next slide? The grid is now at the center of your energy planning. You need to be thinking about grid stability as a precious resource. You need to guard it, and you need to be all the time trying to match those two, resource on the one side and demand on the other side. The thing is that in order to make these pieces fit together, so the pieces of the energy transition puzzle, you need things like energy storage that allow you to shift generation from where you have resources to when you need them. And also, you need to think separately of grid stabilizing services. And getting to the core of this debate, we get into the next slide, please. And here is the thing that many people, or many of the speakers have been talking about now, more recently, Vinod and Roland. And the core of this issue with the energy transition is cost and value, which are completely different propositions. With fossil fuels, a megawatt hour was just a megawatt hour because you could produce it when you needed it. And grid stability really wasn't an issue. You know, it wasn't something that you had to face. But now megawatt hours offer different technologies, from different technologies have different values depending on how they're produced and when. For example, just now we heard from Vinod about the direct and indirect value of each of the technologies and each of the services provided to the grid. Hence why it's time to think of grid at the center of the planning strategy and to think about technologies providing the value that they add using a 360 degrees analysis. And Vinod has provided some strategies for that. Some institutions are already identifying LCO and LCOS, levelized cost of electricity, as faulty measures because they boil down technologies only to one number, which is cost, and they disregard any of the other values that technology brings into the system. And we need to change the way we look at LCOE, or rather we need to look at other measures that might measure the value of each technology better. For example, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has recently published this report that you see on screen, where a new alternative metric to measure the value of technologies is brought forward. Especially from this, it's very important that we consider the holistic perspective of the grid in order to come up with this number. Next slide. The thing is, energy storage adds values because it saves a lot of investment in other areas. We just heard right now from Vinod, how much it can save in infrastructure, but also it saves in area like importing fossil fuels, and it also lowers your CO2 footprint as it brings flexibility to the grid. Next slide. So even though other speakers have spoken about this, at length and with much more complex graphs, you've seen the graphs, Roland showed it and also Vince showed it earlier, where you could see the different energy storage technologies and which is the best service that they each can use and for how long. I'm not going to get into this, but I'm going to simplify what it does for you, the storage, so you understand it. One is essentially it stores energy for later. And two, it adds stability to your grid. And a third option really comes from combining the first two. So you can do both things. But the key that you need to understand when you look at this is you need to be paying also for the grid services that you haven't so far. So therefore, you need to build a business model for the people giving you storage and for the companies offering you this storage, because that's what's going to incentivize the building of this industry in your country or in your area. This is the key for the energy storage business to blossom, really. Next slide. So the rules for coming together and preparing a project are simple. What you need to do first is understand your grid. We've spoken about this. You need to see what are the issues that you are going to tackle? You know, what are your priorities? Understand what services you need now and which are you likely to need in the immediate future. Then you define your objectives and you define your scope. Scope is how much money you can spend and how much time you have to turn it into reality. I cannot stress this enough. This is where you start. If you don't know what you need and what you want to pay for and what is giving you that value to your grid, it's very, very hard to take the next step. So make sure you nail this one down. Next slide. And then you need to be figuring out how you're going to pay for the services that you've prioritized, that you think you need within the scope that you have, that is within the time and budget constraints that you have. And you must have heard already a lot that in order for energy storage to be implemented successfully, it needs a business model, of course, that it allows it to thrive. And many around the world, what they have done is they built revenue stream upon revenue stream, you know, a series of revenue streams together. They talk about stacking of revenues very often, but they're very, very complex generally. I find that the complexity of the systems is what makes it hard to understand. So taking away that complexity, the simplicity would be to look at 3 basic payments. And of course, this is just like a very simple way to look at this. You pay for the availability of the energy storage. You pay for the number of cycles per day or per year that you need and you require, because as you know, that can degrade certain systems, not all of them. And then you pay for the efficiency or the performance that that system gives you. This is the basic way that you need to be thinking about incentivizing the renewable energy storage industry so that it works for you, for your grid, but also for the companies that are working and putting this together. Needs to add value, and at the same time, it needs to work for you. So next slide, please. Something really obvious, but that I see and we see a lot, you know, our technology side in our company works in a lot of international tenders with a lot of international project developers. And one of the biggest issues that we see is that most of the tenders start with technology. We want to build this technology. How do we do it? Okay, where are you building it for? You know, it's not always the best solution for the problems they have. It's just, there is this reason that this technology is the best and I want to do it. If you are trying to do just essentially an R&D project, then go right ahead. That's an R&D project. That is your priority. But if you're doing anything else, then you need to be going at this with complete technology agnostic eyes, because the best solution may not be that the way that you've imagined it. You know, we have heard a lot about how technologies diverse, you know, how diverse they are, how they're different. You know, each of them work in different hours, they work for different services. But once you have your priorities, your objectives and your scope, let the market tell you what is the best solution for your problem, not the other way around, because then you know the value that you want to get, you know, and then you can actually compare things just on the base of the one numerator, which is price. And as Clifford say, when you consider the entire value of the system rather than just the cost, your analysis will definitely change. Next slide, please. I like this slide because, you know, it's a storage solution that perhaps is not what you would think of. You know, Clifford has shown a lot of photos similar to this of concentrated solar power. You have heard about the different types of concentrated solar power earlier, and you've seen different technologies also in his presentation, so I won't elaborate. But the bottom line is this is essentially an 8-hour, 150 megawatt peak turbine battery. There is also one like this in Dubai that is not built yet, but it will be built soon. That will work only during the night so that it counteracts the PV that, you know, DIWA is producing during the day. Abdel Rahim from Mazen is going to be speaking about this project at length, so I'm not going to go into a lot more detail. But if what you need is power for a long time, or you need to counteract, you know, renewables during the day, then maybe you need to be thinking and opening your mind to this, because it might be the most, the best cost value solution for you. So whether it's thermal, cryogenic, zinc air, flow batteries, lithium-ion, or even hydrogen, as we heard before from Neha, keep your options open and let your grid needs decide. Next slide. Another error that we see very often is also this kind of push to either want to hybridize renewables with storage or want standalone projects without really giving it a think behind what is the right approach for the grid. This is also it can be a mistake. Sometimes we see that actually it works against what the grid really needs, because what you do if you have it in a hybrid system, what you're doing, you're extending the hours that that renewable energy asset can work. And perhaps what you need is the ability to be able to transfer energy even for the grid to different times, or you need to be able to provide at different times when the plant is not working. So you need to really be thinking whether this is the best solution for you, and you need to add flexibility, not only in your system, but also in your legislation, so that battery can work for what you need it for. So next slide. My final point is one that is very, very, very important. And it's about the just transition and circularity of your projects. There is not enough thinking about this, not anywhere. We're already seeing more and more problems, not only, for example, in Europe, as more renewables are developed, but also really all over the world. And I'll show you an example now of NIMBism. So it's not in my backyard against these projects. Sometimes they get stopped because the local communities don't want it. And the reason why they don't want it is because we're not being good enough at communicating their values. You need to consider the social and environmental impact of each project. You need to plan the circularity for your project, for your equipment, and for your materials. You need to reduce, reuse, recycle, and repurpose. And so especially you need to be thinking about how many jobs I'm creating, how much know-how am I living locally, and you need to consider this also in your value proposition. This is very important. Just transition is such a basic issue, and we're only seeing the beginning of it. Some industries like wind, they have seen a lot more, but we are at the beginning and we are not preparing enough for what is definitely coming. If I can have next slide. So this is an example of last week, a battery project that got stopped in South Africa from local opposition. And I can tell you, this is just the beginning. We are seeing it everywhere, to mines that mine lithium, to all kinds of developments and projects. If you are not doing your best and really making an effort to create just transition at the center of each of the project planning efforts, this is just going to be one of the issues that you're going to find very, very soon. So this is all from me. I hope that you found it interesting. And in the next slide, I leave my details in case you want to ask me anything or any links. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Billin. Great presentation, really interesting discussion. It is kind of funny to think that in a session about technology, you want to be sort of technology neutral or agnostic, but it really makes a lot of sense. And putting the grid center is a great way to think about this. Another thing that I'm really glad you highlighted is the issue of just transitions. It's something that we in the SIF think a lot about, and we have an ongoing just transition initiative, and we're taking lessons from that, trying to incorporate it in our work in the Global Energy Storage Program and in others. And part of that, as you said, is about reducing, reusing, recycling. And I think the approach that is required in energy systems moving forward really needs a holistic view when thinking about the end of the life of different assets in a way that we have not considered before. So with that in mind, I want to turn it over to Brittany Westlake to talk to us a bit about some of the work that EPRI has done looking into recycling and end of use for different storage technologies. Brittany, take it away.
Thank you. And is my audio okay? So yeah, and thanks for Beline. She wasn't a plant, but that was the perfect setup. I encourage everyone to take that work and just transition slide that she presented at the end there, and put that up and review that every time you're looking through projects. And so, yeah, as Danny mentioned, I'm going to kind of shift the focus. We've thought about all the technologies. We've thought about, these black box capabilities and sort of the gray box of what your grid project needs. And there's so much uncertainty in planning. But, one thing that's both uncertain and certain is that one day these systems are going to reach end of life. And so I challenge you as you're thinking about the cost and the value of these projects, and which ones you're selecting for your site and your application, to also think ahead to some of those end of life costs. So if you want to go to the next slide. As we think of these systems in our heads, we picture batteries, or we picture, a molten salt molecule, but they're really systems. And so this is an example of a system in the American Southwest. And so you can see on this side, there's 2 HVAC units. There's 2 more on the other side. You have the batteries in that doored cabinet. You have the HVAC thermal management. You have the transformers and the power conversion systems. And so as we think about the capital cost of putting these assets on the grid, we also need to think ahead of what are the costs, what are the liabilities of the total system, and recycling it, reusing it at the end of life. There was a question earlier in the chat. And also, this is a reminder, fire your Slido back up. Start throwing your questions in for the panel, because when I'm done, you'll have a chance to talk to us. So there's your poke. But there was a question earlier about the battery fire that we had here in the US in Illinois. And I think that also highlights the importance of thinking about decommissioning. In that case, it was an unpermitted, rather not well thought through plan where they were just storing batteries in a warehouse with a leaky roof. And so while there's certainly, safety issues with any technology, it's important, especially in these storage systems, to think about those safety considerations, what you're doing. I think across the board, whether it's solar panels, wind panels. Here where I live in Raleigh, we recently had a landfill fire where it was a mulch pile at a landfill, but huge affected traffic at rush hour now that it's kicking back up. So really just highlighting wherever these systems are going, whatever they're being used for, think through to that end. Eventually one day, those warranties will run out, that performance will run out, and thinking through how do you do that end of life. And so if you want to go to the next slide. We started this work in 2015, and admittedly the report here and this methodology was developed for California utilities. But it's amazing to take a step back from 2015 to 2021 and see how far the battery recycling industry has come. In 2015, I was one of the only people who ever really wanted to talk about it at conferences. And now you've seen the industry develop. In China, you have recycling requirements as well as the creation of regional hubs for collection. In Europe, you have a producer responsibility. And it's really important, even at the beginning of the project, to think what's involved in recycling, who's responsible, what are those costs of disposal, what are those regulations and guidelines. And I think regulations always get a bad rap, but they're important. They're important for safety so that the asset isn't damaged, so that your staff and labor and local communities don't have to evacuate because of an incident. I think there's also the recent news on material shortages. One of the costs involved with these batteries is, taking apart, recovering the materials, but that's also a benefit. As we think about beginning of life CapEx on these systems, some of them have cheap materials. We still need to look at how do you properly, dispose of, recycle those, but some of them have more expensive materials. And you can balance some of that initial cost of life, CapEx cost, with recovering those materials at end of life. And also, as we look up the scale up of battery energy storage systems, I think really an opportunity to, instead of mining new resources, recover some from the batteries. And I just want to stop and highlight, you've heard about a number of technologies today. This recycling work is primarily focused on lithium because that is what is being deployed at wide scales, and this recycling industry is developing to meet those needs. But I think a similar methodology is what we've outlined in this paper could be applied to vanadium flow batteries, the electrolyzers and fuel cells and hydrogen production, the thermal energy storage, the value in the molten salts. And if you go to the next slide, I'll walk you through some of that process and thinking about it. And before this seems overwhelming, I want you to stop and think, decommissioning a system is really just the reverse of the installation. And taking the system apart is actually easier than finding all those materials and manufacturing those energy storage systems or those batteries at the beginning of life. And so while these are definitely important, fun, complex issues to think about, don't let them be overwhelming. But one place where it's really valuable is to start that thinking at the beginning. As you're installing these systems, look at what the transportation requirements were. collect the system information. So you have the safety data sheets on them. Collect, in New York, you can't take batteries through tunnels. So look at all those installation considerations and save that for the future when you're having to do this decommissioning. Think about the local labor that went into installing it. Who's de-energizing, disconnecting these? Who can safely remove these modules or these storage components? Where are the local resources for transporting, the crane, the forklift? Yours truly has been known to find the most convenient local city and cold call crane and truck companies to get a better sense of what those costs might be, and thinking about that. So think about it not just a cost for these projects, but also an opportunity to either develop or leverage local resources to work in this space. Then, of course, transportation and shipping. Some safety requirements, batteries are classified as hazardous materials here in the United States, and definitely important to transport those safely. But again, thinking through how those were manufactured and delivered can inform some of the end of life, no matter where the system is going on in the globe. Within them, we had the picture at the beginning of the storage system, and whether it's a transformer with an oil that needs to be disposed of, power conversion system with some of the electronics, or the batteries, look through what those components are. Where does it make sense? And you could potentially do local scrap metal or electronics recycling. And what are the more specialty battery materials? Here in the US, in the 2017 timeframe when that first report was done, there was a Canadian and a US company that were really set up for battery recycling. Since then, it's grown, and there's more facilities that can handle recycling. But think through where you're locating these batteries and where you might send either the vanadium flow battery material for reuse in batteries or in use in other industrial applications, or the batteries for material recovery. And think about, how do you safely process and store them for those sites? And then if you want to go to the next slide, I think we've given you so much to think about today in terms of what do you need storage to do? How do you value that? What technologies can do it? How do you develop the business case? And then in challenging you to think about end of life, I'm going to make it a little bit easier in terms of suggesting different ways where you can think about that. As you're doing that planning and procurement, think about the end of life, think about the total cost of operating the storage system. If you're in a, high temperature environment, watch what kind of, thermal management, whether it's heating or cooling on the batteries you might need. When you get to the contracting stage, you developed a project, you have a site, you're working on putting it with solar or wind or, request an end of life plan. The people developing this system, developing the project and thinking through the installation are very well positioned to think through how could you decommission and remove these materials and get them kind of safe and responsibly handled. Ask for rough cost estimates, but knowing that gets you into the uncertainty of a lot of those cost estimates and material prices are based on commodity markets that are without any doubt certain to change. But also ask for some of the logistical components of identified transportation or disposal vendors who might be able to help when these reach end of life. Also, the challenge of thinking about it during operation. Different technologies have different capabilities. There's different parts of using those technologies that cause degradation or other components. And so as you're thinking about these assets and whatever application you're going to use them, consider some of those cost and benefits of how you're using it, how you're designing those use cases. I think the big image for this one, though, is, ships are safest in port, but that's not what ships are made of. These batteries, these energy storage systems, they're designed to support the grid, but making sure that you're taking all those considerations in as you're utilizing them in the application. And then, when you do get to end of life, look for disposal experts that have demonstrated verifiable performance. Make sure they're not putting it in a warehouse with a leaky roof here in Illinois. And some of that, I think, is developing the industry across storage technologies. It's heartening for me to watch. It's really kind of growing and developing to support these technologies. And with that, I will pause and see if we have any questions or maybe shift to the panel I'd love to hear what you guys still wonder about after hearing all these great speakers. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Brittany, for that. Yeah, a lot to chew on. Really important to consider the end of life at the beginning of the process. And I think your content will really help us do that. If we can bring up the gallery view, we don't have a lot of time left in this session, but we have a couple questions that I'd like to be able to get to. So I'm gonna pose those now. I see a couple in Slido. I think maybe I'll read a couple so that people can respond. Vinod, I know you have to go, so maybe we'll just put these out there and let people respond to them as they see fit. The first question that I see is, can someone speak on warranties in battery energy storage systems, since degradation is business case specific, limited warranty affects flexibility, and therefore does it affect the business case? There's another one that I think is meaningful and one that relates to a question I had. Is there a market for frequency regulation in developing economies? Do utilities in these countries compensate for frequency regulation? Which I think gets to the question I had, which is, what aspects of the framework, the tools, the business case are applicable across different types of energy systems and in different countries? And what are very context specific that people should be considering when they go over these? Maybe we'll start with these two. And I know, Vinod, you have to leave. So if you're still on, if there's any of those you want to tackle, or maybe we just lost him. We might have just lost him. So sorry, it took too long to answer the question. How about we'll go down the line, starting with Roland. Roland, of those two questions, which, what answers do you have and thoughts, please?
No, let's say, in general, let's say if we want to make storage working and battery storage, and that there is a possibility to get also financing for storage, warranties are extremely important, and also certain standards for battery storage packages is a key thing. On the technical side, there are so many aspects that it is very difficult to give let's say a clear picture. So I think there is a possibility even to get insurances that give certain guarantees, but it very much depends on technologies and standards. But I think this is a very essential and important question to make at least battery storage working. I'm not sure, there may be other more technical specialists that can say something on warranties. Thank you.
I can just add, not something very specific, but there is a massive bottleneck right now in terms of the capacity that most of the tier one, or however you want to call manufacturers, the demand that they have and the amount they can put out, because there is not a lot of necessarily bankable technologies in lithium-ion. That all depends on how you look at the project, of course. Each project is different. But if you're looking at lithium-ion, I think the question came very much from that end. There is an issue of bottleneck of, as I said, how much batteries can be manufactured from those key bankable manufacturers that give you the warranties that are required. So there is a lot of news, you just have to put it in Google and you'll find out a lot of news, especially in the market in the US. So you can read a little bit more about the reasons and the situation there. And regarding the second question, I think that's more for Roland really than from any of us about the frequency regulation in different countries, whether it's a service they're willing to pay for.
Yeah, it's difficult to say, but it's has a lot to do with the grid codes and what is chosen and needs to be aligned. So it is, if you develop a battery storage, you clearly have to be aware of the technical aspects that are offered in the grid, because that is there's a lot of relationship in the technology related to how the grid is operated, and let's say different technologies may be more suitable, but I'm also not a specialist on this. IRENA tries to advise specifically on different types of grid codes that help to integrate higher shares of variable renewables that also take those aspects of frequency and such into account. But it's very difficult to give a specific answer to such a question. But it matters. It is important. That's clear.
Thank you, Roland. One, I guess this is a comment for that I'd like Brittany to respond to on Slido. It says, quite discerning listening to this, those that have been pushing for transformation of energy systems have not been honest on the whole of system cost. Just interested to hear your reaction to that, and that, you know, are we sort of now incorporating costs that were ignored previously? And what's the level of cost? How should people be thinking about this when they put it in the business case, this sort of end of life cycle approach?
So thank you, Danny. I saw that one come in. I don't think it's disconcerting for, I think it's amazing that storage systems are thinking about end of life costs so early in their development. If you've been to flow battery conferences, you hear them talk about kind of the recoverability of their materials. I think it's amazing that we've gotten the industry to introduce it into the conversation. I would challenge you to look across the energy space and find other examples of kind of really good end of life cost thinking. Being in this space, I challenge my colleagues who work on gas turbines. You know, how do they plan for the dismantling? And oftentimes it's, oh, that equipment still has value at end of life. We'll sell it to other countries. You know, and how do we think about it for vehicles, right? Everyone's seen pictures of, you know, a junkyard filled with vehicles. So sometimes I feel guilty for forcing the end of life thinking on the battery conversation, because you're forcing them to take that total cost of ownership, where other technologies, you know, developing across the industry have not kind of stepped up, and they're not being held to those. I mean, I challenge you to look at Lazard's levelized cost of energy, Google end of life, or search for end of life costs in it. It's not considered across any of those technologies. So I don't think this is disingenuous in the industry. I've been impressed with how willing they are to be held with this higher standard.
That's a great point, Brittany. And it brings me back to the beginning of Roland's presentation, which put this whole conversation in context as sort of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, the goals that we are working toward when it comes to responding to climate. And, you know, the idea that gas turbines can just be dismantled and sold to another country. Well, if we're going to get on the zero carbon path, they won't be able to, because we will need to phase away from those assets entirely. One last question before we leave, because it was sent in the chat and also I think on Slido. It's for Roland. Roland, the question is, what is the price component ratio between renewable energy and storage, and what's more cost effective, battery or thermal? Responses to that, if you have any.
I have not the latest figures in my head there, but it was the cost relation between renewables and batteries directly, or yeah, it's let's say let's say that has so many aspects. It depends also very much where you do it. But the latest time we were working on a small island development state in the Pacific, and there it was actually a horrible relation. So it was, let's say 1, 2, and then 2 times more for the storage. But it's really depending on the site and where you are doing this. And that, of course, specifically in let's say, not everybody is selling things in the South Pacific, for instance. So, and that makes it, let's say, there is lower competition, and then the prices for storage are even higher. But let's say in the transition where you see now that storage, battery storage is substantially used, is in the integration of variable renewables on islands, because as lower the capacity of the system, as quicker you need a battery storage, and you have less other options, you know. And there you clearly see it. That's the place where these technologies are really used at the moment. And yeah, also the islands are in a situation to find the money for this. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Roland. It's a great point, and it really drives home something that I try to keep in mind all the time, which is place matters. It matters when you're thinking about renewable energy assets, and it clearly matters when you're thinking about storage assets as well. We could go on and on. We're already over time, so I'm going to end the panel now. I hope our experts will be able to stick around for the breakout sessions. And there's been so much knowledge and information that we've gathered today that we're going to try to think of ways to capture it beyond this event so that we can share with the audience. So, you know, potentially stay tuned for that. We're already doing some noodling behind the scenes, and we'll continue to do that. But again, I just want to give a big thanks to all the presenters in this panel. Really rich, excellent discussion. Appreciate your time. Tom, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Danny. And I echo the thanks, Roland, Belen, and Brittany and Binod, who had to leave us. Super rich. And as Danny was saying, you know, lots of things rolling in on chat. People are sharing a lot of resources there. The presenters have been sharing a lot of resources. We'll be pulling those together and be able to provide those to folks after the event today. And then I'm also gratified to see the conversation in chat, in addition to what the speakers are able to address, to really get at some of the questions that people are posing. If there are questions that feel like they deserve some more answers and some more time, as Danny said, we'll be looking to ways to share that following up from the event today. But why don't we move now into another break, and when we get back from the break, we'll be going into a couple of breakout sessions, one focused on battery storage and another focused on other technologies for long duration and grid storage. We've got another video to show during the break time. This one is more focused on concentrated solar power and thermal storage. So folks who would like to stick around during the break to watch that video, we invite you to do that. This one will also be available on the event page after the meeting today. So why don't we look to reconvene no later than 50 minutes after the hour, 10 of, and then we'll have a little bit of time to just give a brief overview of the breakouts and then jump into those. So please rejoin at no later than 10 minutes to the hour, and why don't we take a break and run the video.
Zina and Kaku are parabolic trough plants. This means that a set of parabolic-shaped mirrors, trough, tracks the movement of the sun and concentrates solar radiation onto a receiving tube filled with the heat transfer fluid, HTF. The HTF flowing through the solar field reaches a temperature of about 400 degrees Celsius. When the HTF reaches the heat exchanger, the water turns into steam, which powers the turbines that generate electricity dispatched to the grid. To reduce water consumption, once the steam has gone through the turbine, it's channeled through an air cooler condenser, ACC, and reintroduced in a closed water cycle. Along its path in the solar field, the HTF circulates through a thermal storage heat exchanger. This exchanger is connected to two insulated tanks, the hot and cold salt tanks. During the day, salt from the cold tank is pumped through the thermal storage heat exchanger, where it is heated by the HTF and stored in the hot tank. In the evening, when solar radiation is lower or non-existent, hot salt is pumped back from the hot tank into the cold salt tank, releasing the heat to the HTF in the thermal storage heat exchanger. The HTF, once again heated, then reaches the heat exchanger, releases the heat into the water, and the resulting steam powers the turbines, which dispatch electricity to the grid during peak hours or after nightfall. Key works differently. The plant's trademark is a 200-meter high concrete tower with 3 receivers at the top. The receivers contain water and act as boilers. They are heated by more than 4,000 heliostats, each comprising an impressive 140 square meter of reflective surface. These mirrors track the sun's position and reflect the heat onto the receivers. The receivers produce steam that is passed onto a turbine to generate electricity. The used steam takes advantage of the tower natural air cooler condenser to be once again transformed into water and reused for the next cycle. To provide electricity when solar radiation is lower or non-existent, a portion of the steam is also diverted to 19 steam accumulators at ground level. When the stored steam is released to the turbine, Key is able to continue to provide power to the grid even when the sun isn't shining.
Time to take a break there. We're going to move into our final session here, and this will run for 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so. What we wanted to do during this time was create the opportunity for some smaller groups to get together via Zoom in a little more of an informal setting and dive into this question of customizing business cases to country context and needs. And we've talked about the range of energy storage technologies that are out there. We've talked about some framework and tools and things to keep in mind regarding the selection of energy storage technologies and the design and implementation of energy storage projects. But we recognize that every situation is different in some ways or another, whether we're talking about a particular facility, whether we're talking about a country, whether we're talking about a particular region. And what we want to do in these breakout sessions is really dive into what are some of those considerations that should be taken into account when thinking about energy storage, choice among energy storages and the design of projects. So we're going to have 2 breakout sessions that we'll ask you to select between, and maybe we can go to the next slide and I'll just describe the 2 sessions, and then we'll have a little bit of instructions on how to enter the breakout sessions. So the first one will be focused on battery storage, and we'll be talking about examples from Maldives. We'll be talking about a couple of examples in Thailand. We'll be talking about battery storage technologies in South Africa in this session. I know the question came up earlier whether this will be off-grid, on-grid. I think battery storage one will be a mixture of the 2, though I think those questions and discussions can come up in either one of these. So I'll be moderating this session. For those of you who are mainly interested in battery storage, I would encourage you to join breakout session 1. The second session, if we go to the next slide, will be on long duration and utility scale storage. So these are other energy storage technologies beyond batteries that are playing complementary, but also some different roles in energy systems. So we'll be hearing about a range of energy storage technologies that are in place and being considered in Morocco. We'll be hearing about green hydrogen and how that fits into a range of sort of system and economic development considerations in Chile. And then we'll be talking in this session about pumped hydro and how that can fit into energy systems. This session will be moderated by my colleague, Tim Larson from Ross Strategic. And for those of you who are interested in sort of thinking beyond batteries or thinking about long duration, utility scale storage, I would encourage you to join this breakout session. And in both of these, we're going to keep things kind of informal. It'll be a little bit of a fireside chat format. We have speakers who will be kind of anchoring us in the work that they are doing, and then we'll move pretty quickly into discussion. And we would encourage everybody to both offer your questions in discussions, but recognizing that we've got a great group here of people with experience all around the world. So we'll be asking you for your insights as well. So be thinking about which of these breakout sessions you would like to join. The next slide just gives a little bit of instructions on how to do this. So again, the choices are between battery storage and long duration and utility scale. There's a little, if you look at your Zoom toolbox, there should be a breakout room button at the bottom. When you click that, you will be asked to join one of these rooms. Even if you're in the breakout sessions, you should have access to that breakout room button if you decide you ended up in the wrong room and you want to move around. And then my colleague Tess Wendell will be remaining in the main room to help people get into the places that they want to be. So with that, why don't we launch the breakout rooms, and we will see people there. We'll be returning back to the main session at about 40 minutes after or so for a wrap up for the meeting.
Great, launching rooms.
Great. Well, good. I thank you all so much for the discussions in the breakout sessions. I know in the battery storage session, we covered a lot of ground related to policy, to technology, to assessing value, and just some fascinating examples from Thailand, Maldives, and South Africa. So really rich discussion there. Tim, any quick highlights from the other breakout session that you'd like to share?
Yeah, really rich discussion. I wish we had more time for it. We spent a bunch of time talking about pumped hydro and some of the specific applications there, particularly in some of the SIF pipeline. I know that there's some dam retrofit projects, which may be an important opportunity. I did wish we had more time to explore the green hydrogen angle. There's some exciting work and studies going on in Chile. And then the potential for thermal, long duration thermal storage was, I think, really came through in the Morocco experience. Yeah, so it was a rich discussion. Wish we had more time, but I want to thank our speakers for a great discussion.
Great, thank you, Tim. And I will channel my mother-in-law, who apparently, when all of her children were little, said, "It's good to quit while everyone is still having fun." So there are many more conversations to have, clearly, and I think that sort of sets the stage for this learning platform going forward. And so I will turn it back over for just the final wrap up here, back to Danny Morris to talk a little bit about where we're headed with the Global Energy Storage Program and this learning platform. So Danny, go ahead.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you, Tim, for great moderation in the two breakout panels. You know, you don't often say fun when you're talking about seminars and things like this, but it's just, this has been a really rich discussion. When you set these kind of things up, you hope for the best and you don't always know what to expect. I've personally have just really been blown away by the depth of knowledge of our speakers, the real richness of experience, and think that this is excellent stuff that we need to get out to larger parts of the storage world, different stakeholders and things like that. And so we will brainstorm ways to do that and ways to keep you all involved in the conversation, because it has been really good. So the learning platform is an ongoing thing. As we said before, this is the second of a number of events. And with this session, we really wanted to focus on the technology. We also recognize, and I think it came through in a number of different presentations today, that there is a real hunger and demand to understand financing and how energy storage projects can get sponsored, how they can get financed, and how the economics over time can work. So we're really looking to do that in our next event, which will be in a little while. We're coming up on the summer months here in the Northern Hemisphere, which means work will slow down a bit. And then when we start up in the fall, I can only speak for us in the climate investment funds, but things are going to be quite crazy in the lead up to COP26. And there's lots of different events and things going on. And we want to be able to create space for, kind of meaningful conversations that take time to shape and absorb. So we are probably looking at this point for another event in the latter half of, or the latter quarter really of 2021, when some of the noise and excitement around the COP is quieted down and we can take a step into these deeper issues. So we don't have a date yet. We will keep all of you posted through our list, the distribution list that we've developed from this event and the last event. And we will also be looking for ways to share what we learned today. As I mentioned earlier, I think we as a team with Ross Strategic will get together and think of how we can translate some of what we've heard and share it with you all in a digestible form that can be really meaningful. With that, I want to say a big thanks to the Ross Strategic team who put in a lot of work to make this event happen. Also, big thanks to our partners at the U.S. Department of Energy, in particular, the Pacific Northwest National Lab and their staff have really been instrumental in bringing some of these experts to you all today, and really have benefited from their insight and knowledge, and hopefully will continue to do so. And finally, I'll just give a big shout out to my team and the climate investment funds who've put in a lot of work to make this thing happen. We look forward to staying in touch with all of you. We look forward to hearing about how things proceed in your work and sharing those experiences as much as we can. So if you all have questions, I don't know if the form on the website still allows for people to submit questions, but please reach out and we'll find ways to take the learning that we've done today, move it forward and to engage with all of you as we all kind of push on our various levers to move the world closer to a zero carbon pathway. So thank you all for participating and look forward to seeing you again at the next event down the line.